I'm Marcus. I've been working campground maintenance at Pine Ridge State Park for going on 18 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at you. Broken equipment, bear encounters, the occasional drunk camper causing trouble, nothing that a little common sense and experience couldn't handle. That all changed in August of 2019. It was a Tuesday morning, early shift. I was making my usual rounds through the Oak Loop campgrounds, checking trash receptacles and restrooms before the day got too hot. Site 23 caught my attention because the campfire was still smoldering, which violated park regulations about unattended fires. I figured I'd better check it out. Maybe leave a friendly reminder note for whoever was staying there. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. No voices, no movement, no sounds of a family getting ready for the day. Just the soft whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a jay somewhere up the ridge. Their sedan was parked properly in the designated spot. Michigan plates. Nothing unusual about it. The tent was a nice blue Coleman, maybe 8-person capacity, properly staked and squared up on the tent pad like whoever set it up knew what they were doing. I called out a hello as I approached. Standard procedure. No response. The tent was zipped shut, which seemed odd for such a warm morning. Most folks would have the rain fly open by now, trying to get some air circulation going. I knocked on one of the aluminum poles and called out again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the coffee. 2 mugs sitting on the wooden picnic table, steam still rising from them. Real steam, mind you, not just morning mist. The coffee was black in one mug, cream and sugar in the other, and both were hot enough that I could feel the warmth when I held my hand above them. Next to the mugs were 2 plates with half-finished breakfast. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast cut diagonally. The eggs were still soft. The butter on the toast hadn't even started to congeal. Car keys were lying right there in the middle of the table, along with a smartphone in a pink case and a park map folded open to our section of trails. A small backpack sat on the bench, unzipped, with water bottles and trail mix visible inside. Everything looked like a family had just stepped away for a moment, maybe to use the restroom or take a quick walk. But then I saw the shoes. Right by the tent entrance, arranged in a perfect line, were 3 pairs of footwear. Adult hiking boots, men's size 11 or 12, placed heel to heel. Women's trail runners, maybe size 8, positioned exactly parallel to the men's boots, and between them, a tiny pair of purple sneakers with cartoon characters on them, the kind a young child would wear. They were lined up with the precision of someone organizing a closet, toes all pointing the same direction, laces tucked neatly inside. Something about those little purple shoes made my stomach tighten. Kids don't arrange their shoes like that. Kids kick them off wherever they land and leave them there. But these were positioned like someone had taken great care to make them perfect. I unzipped the tent carefully and peered inside. 3 sleeping bags, all unzipped and spread open like the occupants had just gotten up. Suitcases organized along one wall, clothes folded and stacked. A small pile of books, children's chapter books, with bookmarks showing they were being read. Everything was neat, orderly, undisturbed. No signs of hurry, no signs of struggle, no indication that anything was wrong. I stepped back and looked around the campsite again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The fire had burned down to coals, but there were fresh logs stacked nearby, ready to feed the flames. A cooler sat closed beside the table. I opened it and found it fully stocked with food for several more days. Milk that wouldn't expire until next week, fresh fruit, sandwich meat that still had yesterday's grocery store sticker on the package. I called the ranger station on my radio and reported what I'd found. Ranger Kelly arrived about 20 minutes later, and we went through the campsite together. She took photos, made notes, checked the vehicle registration. The car was registered to David Chen of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Kelly ran the plates and found no warrants, no alerts, nothing suspicious. We waited 2 hours before calling it in to local law enforcement. Park policy required us to give campers reasonable time to return before assuming something was wrong. But as the morning wore on and the coffee grew cold, We both knew we weren't dealing with a family that had just gone for an early hike. The sheriff's department treated it as a missing persons case. They interviewed other campers, checked with the park entrance to see when the Chen family had arrived, reviewed what little security footage we had from the main buildings. The family had checked in Saturday afternoon. David Chen, his wife Susan, and their 7-year-old daughter, Emma. They'd paid for a week's stay, told the gate attendant they were looking forward to some hiking and fishing. Nobody had seen them since Sunday evening. The search lasted 4 days. Search and rescue teams combed every trail within a 10-mile radius. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the forest, calling their names. We had helicopters, tracking dogs, thermal imaging equipment. The dogs picked up scent trails leading from the campsite toward the Blue Ridge Trail. But the trails ended abruptly about half a mile into the woods, as if the family had simply vanished. Their car was processed for evidence. Nothing unusual. Some crumbs in the back seat, Emma's coloring books, a phone charger plugged into the dashboard. Susan's purse was in the glove compartment with her ID, credit cards, and nearly $300 in cash. David's wallet was tucked under the driver's seat, also untouched. The case went cold within 2 weeks. The official report listed the family as missing persons, cause unknown. The campsite was released back to the park, and life went on. But I couldn't stop thinking about those shoes, lined up so perfectly by the tent entrance. I started paying closer attention after that, really looking at the campsites I serviced instead of just going through the motions. Most people are messy when they camp. They leave gear scattered around, clothes hanging from tree branches, coolers left open, shoes kicked off randomly. It's vacation. They relax their standards a little. That's normal. But over the next few months, I started noticing other sites that were too clean, too organized. Not many, maybe one every few weeks, but enough to form a pattern in my mind. I'd find a campsite where everything was arranged just so. Gear organized, clothes folded, personal items placed with deliberate precision, and the families would be gone. Not all of them. Some came back from their hikes or their trips to the shower house, and I'd feel foolish for worrying. But others didn't. 3 more families that fall, 2 the following spring. Always the same pattern. Organized campsites, warm food, personal belongings left behind, and people who simply weren't there anymore. I started keeping my own notes, unofficial records that I didn't share with anyone. License plates, descriptions of the missing families, dates and times. I told myself I was being paranoid, seeing connections that weren't really there. But the pattern was undeniable. The thing that haunts me most isn't the mystery of where they went. People disappear in the wilderness sometimes. It's tragic, but it happens. What keeps me awake at night is remembering how those campsites looked. The careful arrangement of personal items, the precision with which everything was placed. It wasn't the kind of organization that happens naturally. It was the kind that suggests someone took time. Someone who cared about getting the details exactly right. Someone who wanted everything to look perfect when we found it. I transferred to a different park in 2021. Told my supervisor I needed a change of scenery. Wanted to be closer to my aging parents. That was partly true, but mostly I just couldn't walk through those Oak Loop campsites anymore without checking every table, every tent entrance, every line of shoes that might be arranged a little too neatly. I still think about the Chen family sometimes. David, Susan, and little Emma with her purple sneakers. I wonder if they're still out there somewhere in those mountains, or if they found their way to wherever people go when they step away from a warm cup of coffee and never come back. The new maintenance worker at Pine Ridge is a young guy named Tyler. I talked to him a few months ago, asked how he was settling in. He mentioned finding some strange campsites, places where families seemed to have just vanished, leaving everything behind. He said it like it was unusual, like he'd never seen anything like it before. I didn't tell him about my notes, or about the pattern I'd observed. I just told him to pay attention, to trust his instincts if something felt wrong. Some things you have to figure out for yourself, but I still keep those notes in my desk drawer. Dates, descriptions, license plate numbers, just in case someone else starts noticing the same things I did. just in case those perfectly organized campsites aren't as random as everyone thinks they are. I'm Elena. I've been supervising trail crews in the Cascade Mountains for 14 years now, and I know these paths better than most people know their own neighborhoods. Trail maintenance isn't glamorous work. We clear fallen trees, repair erosion damage, replace worn signage, and make sure hikers can navigate safely through some pretty unforgiving terrain. It's methodical, predictable work that keeps people safe. At least, it used to be. The Ridge Trail has always been one of our easier maintenance routes. It's a well-established path that follows the natural contour of Miller Ridge for about 8 miles, connecting the main visitor center to the backcountry camping areas. The trail is clearly marked every quarter mile, with numbered wooden posts. Standard Park Service design, nothing fancy. Weather-resistant wood, reflective numbers, basic directional information. We've been using the same design for over 20 years. The problems started in late spring of 2021. I first noticed something was off when our crew was doing the quarterly marker inspection. Trail markers 846 and 848 were exactly where they should be, properly secured and in good condition. But marker 847 was missing entirely. That wasn't particularly unusual. Markers get damaged by weather, knocked down by falling branches, sometimes even removed by vandals or souvenir hunters. We keep replacement markers in our maintenance shed specifically for this kind of situation. I sent Tommy, one of our seasonal crew members, to install a new marker, 847, the following Monday. The replacement disappeared within 3 days. Tommy swore he'd installed it correctly. Proper depth, concrete footer, the whole procedure. But when I hiked out to check his work, there was nothing but a small hole in the ground where the marker should have been. No broken wood, no concrete fragments, no sign that anything had ever been there except that perfectly round hole in the earth. I figured maybe we had a persistent vandal, someone with a strange fixation on that particular marker. We replaced it again, and this time I had Tommy take photos of the installation process for our records. The marker looked solid, professionally installed, exactly like the dozens of others we'd placed over the years. It vanished again within a week. That's when the search and rescue calls started coming in. The first call came on a Tuesday morning in June. A woman named Patricia Mills called the emergency line from her cell phone, saying she was lost somewhere between markers 846 and 848 on the Ridge Trail. She sounded confused, not panicked, just genuinely bewildered about where she was. According to her GPS coordinates, she was standing roughly where marker 847 should have been. I volunteered to hike out and guide her back to the main trail. The Ridge Trail is completely straight through that section. You literally cannot get lost if you stay on the path. There are no side trails, no confusing intersections, just a clear dirt path running along the ridgeline with excellent visibility in both directions. But when I arrived at the coordinates Patricia had given us, there was nobody there. I called out, searched the immediate area, even walked a quarter mile in each direction. No sign of her anywhere. I radioed back to dispatch, and they tried calling her number. The call went straight to voicemail. Patricia Mills turned up at the visitor center 2 hours later, looking tired but unharmed. She said she'd somehow found her way back to the parking area, but couldn't remember exactly how. When we asked her about getting lost, she seemed genuinely confused by our questions. She insisted she'd never called for help and didn't remember being lost at all. I checked her phone. There was no record of any outgoing calls that morning. Over the next 3 months, we received 6 more similar calls, always from hikers who claimed to be lost between markers 846 and 848. Always from the same GPS coordinates, and always, when we arrived to help, there was nobody there. 2 of the callers we never found at all. The other 4 turned up later at various locations around the park. The visitor center, the picnic area, even the parking lot at the trailhead for a completely different trail 5 miles away. None of them remembered calling for help. None of them remembered being lost. We replaced marker 847 4 more times that summer. Each installation followed the same pattern: proper procedure, solid construction, and then complete disappearance within days. No vandalism, no storm damage, no logical explanation. The marker would simply be gone, leaving only that small, perfectly round hole in the ground. I started documenting everything: installation dates, disappearance dates, search and rescue call logs, GPS coordinates. I created a file that I kept in my office, updating it every time something strange happened around that section of trail. The pattern was undeniable, but I couldn't make sense of it. In August, I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I installed the seventh replacement marker myself, taking extra care with the concrete footer and using our best weather-resistant materials. Then I hiked back to that section of trail every single day for 2 weeks, checking to make sure the marker was still there. On day 12, the marker was gone. But this time, I found something else. About 10 feet off the main trail, partially hidden under a fallen pine branch, I discovered a small pile of wooden fragments. They were pieces of trail markers, not just ours, but different designs from different time periods. Some had faded paint that looked decades old. Others were obviously recent, including fragments that matched the reflective numbers we'd been using. I counted the pieces carefully. There were enough fragments to account for at least 15 different markers, maybe more, all bearing the number 847. That's when I realized we hadn't been dealing with a recent problem. This had been happening for years, possibly decades. Marker 847 had been disappearing and being replaced over and over again, creating an accumulating pile of debris hidden just off the trail. I brought the fragments back to our maintenance shed and tried to piece together a timeline based on the different wood treatments and number styles. The oldest pieces appeared to date back to the 1980s, shortly after the Ridge Trail was first established. The newest were from the marker I'd installed just 12 days earlier. I reported my findings to the park supervisor, expecting him to launch some kind of investigation. Instead, he seemed oddly unsurprised by the whole situation. He thanked me for the documentation, filed my report, and told me to stop replacing marker 847 for the time being. When I asked why, he said the Park Service had dealt with similar issues before. Sometimes certain locations just don't hold trail markers well due to soil conditions or underground water flow. He suggested we simply update our trail maps to reflect the gap and advise hikers accordingly. But that didn't explain the search and rescue calls. It didn't explain how people could get lost on a straight trail with excellent visibility. And it didn't explain why none of the lost hikers remembered calling for help. I kept monitoring the situation through the fall and winter. The emergency calls continued, always from the same coordinates, always with the same pattern. We'd dispatch someone to help, find nobody there, and then the caller would turn up elsewhere in the park with no memory of being lost. In March of 2022, I received a transfer opportunity to lead a trail crew in Olympic National Park. It was a promotion, better pay, a chance to work on more challenging terrain. I probably should have been excited about the opportunity. Instead, I found myself reluctant to leave, not because I loved the job here, but because I felt like I was abandoning something unfinished. Marker 847 was still missing. The emergency calls were still coming in, and nobody else seemed to think any of it was worth investigating. My replacement is a young guy named Derek, who transferred in from Yellowstone. I spent a week training him, showing him our maintenance routes, explaining our procedures. When we got to the section of Ridge Trail, between markers 846 and 848, I pointed out the gap where 847 should be. Derek asked if we should install a replacement marker. I told him the park supervisor had decided against it for now. I didn't mention the pile of fragments I'd found, or the emergency calls, or any of the strange incidents I'd documented over the past year. Some things you have to figure out for yourself. But I left Derek my file, tucked away in the bottom drawer of the maintenance office desk. All my documentation, all my observations, all the questions I never got answers to, just in case he starts noticing the same patterns I did. I still get calls sometimes from my old colleagues, They tell me Derek's been asking questions about Marker 847, that he's received a few strange emergency calls from hikers who claim to be lost on that section of trail. They say he's been hiking out there more often than he needs to, like he's looking for something. Last week, Derek called me directly. He said he'd found my file and wanted to know if I had any theories about what was happening out there. I told him I never came up with any good explanations, that some problems don't have solutions you can write up in a maintenance report. But I also told him to trust his instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if he ever finds himself standing at those GPS coordinates where all the emergency calls come from, he should pay attention to how it makes him feel. Because the truth is, every time I hiked to that spot looking for lost hikers, something felt off. Not dangerous exactly, just wrong in a way I couldn't define. Like standing in a room where all the furniture has been moved 2 inches to the left. Everything looks normal, but your brain knows something isn't quite right. I never found an explanation for Marker 847, but I learned that some places hold on to their mysteries, no matter how many times you try to fix them or explain them away. And sometimes the best thing you can do is document what you observe, leave good notes for whoever comes next, and trust that they'll know what to do with the information when the time comes. The Ridge Trail is still missing. Marker 847. The emergency calls are still coming in. And somewhere in the mountains I used to maintain, there's a small pile of wooden fragments that tells a story nobody wants to hear. I'm Roy. I've been working as a park host at Cedar Lake State Park for going on 9 years now. It's not the most exciting job in the world. Mostly checking in campers, collecting fees, making sure folks follow the rules. But it suits me fine. I like the routine, the quiet evenings, the way most people are pretty decent when they're out here trying to enjoy nature. The job comes with a small trailer right here in the campground. So I'm always around if someone needs help or if there's an emergency. Most nights are peaceful. You get the occasional raccoon getting into someone's cooler. Maybe a camper who's had a little too much to drink getting loud around the fire. Nothing I can't handle with a friendly word and some common sense. But there was one night in September of 2022 that still bothers me. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how little sense it made when I really thought about it afterward. A woman checked into campsite 23 on a Wednesday evening, maybe around 5:30. She was driving a silver Honda Civic, Oregon plates, traveling alone. That's not unusual. We get plenty of solo campers, especially during the quieter weekdays when families with kids aren't around. She seemed pleasant enough when she came to my window to register. Said her name was Linda Marsh, paid cash for 3 nights, and mentioned she was looking forward to some hiking and peace and quiet. I remember her because she asked specific questions about the trail system, wanted to know about difficulty levels and estimated hiking times. She had that careful way of speaking that suggested she'd done her research, knew what she was getting into. Probably in her late 40s. Sensible hiking clothes, the kind of gear that meant she wasn't a complete beginner. She struck me as someone who could take care of herself out here. Site 23 is one of our better spots, tucked back in the pines with decent privacy and a clear view of the lake. I watched her drive over there and start setting up her tent. She worked efficiently, like someone who'd done it plenty of times before. Had her camp organized and a small fire going within an hour. I made my usual evening rounds around 8 o'clock, just walking through the campground to make sure everything was settled for the night. Linda was sitting by her fire reading a paperback book, looked comfortable and content. I gave her a friendly wave, and she waved back. Nothing unusual about any of it. The next morning, I was up early as always to check the restrooms and make sure the water spigots were working properly. That's when I noticed her tent had collapsed. Not damaged by wind or anything like that, just fallen in on itself like someone had pulled out the center pole from inside. I walked over to check on her, figuring maybe she'd had some kind of equipment failure and needed help. Called out good morning, asked if everything was okay. No answer from inside the collapsed tent. I called a little louder, then noticed her car was gone from the parking spot. That seemed odd. If she'd left early for a day hike, why would she collapse her tent? And if she'd decided to leave altogether, why leave the tent behind? I walked around the campsite looking for a note or some explanation, but didn't find anything. After about an hour, I decided I should probably check inside the tent to make sure she wasn't hurt or sick in there. I unzipped the entrance carefully and immediately saw that all her gear was still inside. Sleeping bag, backpack, clothes, personal items, everything you'd expect from someone camping for 3 days. But what really caught my attention was a small plastic pill organizer sitting on top of her sleeping bag, the kind with separate compartments for each day of the week. It was filled with various medications, and I could see pills for Thursday and Friday still waiting in their slots. These looked like prescription medications, the kind people need to take every day. I stepped back and looked around the campsite again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Her car was gone, but all her camping gear was here. Her medications were here. Her wallet was in the tent with her ID and credit cards. Even her car keys were sitting on the picnic table, which didn't make any sense if she'd driven away. I called the ranger station to report the situation. Ranger Martinez came out to take a look, and we went through everything together. Linda Marsh's driver's license showed an address in Portland. Her wallet had about $60 in cash and what looked like her regular credit cards. Nothing suggested any kind of struggle or emergency. Martinez checked the registration log and confirmed that Linda had paid for 3 nights through Saturday. She hadn't checked out with me, and there was no note or message indicating she'd changed her plans. We called the number she'd written on her registration form, but it went straight to a voicemail box that was full. What really puzzled us was her car. The park only has one entrance, and all vehicles have to pass through the gate where we keep electronic logs. I checked the records, and Linda's Honda Civic had entered the park Wednesday evening at 5:27, which matched my memory of when she'd checked in. But there was no record of her car leaving. Martinez suggested maybe there was a glitch in the gate system, that somehow her departure hadn't been logged properly. But I've been working here 9 years, and I've never seen the gate fail to record a vehicle passing through. It's a pretty simple system. Magnetic sensors that register every car going in either direction. We contacted the local sheriff's department, and Deputy Williams came out to take a report. He photographed the campsite, collected Linda's personal information, and said he'd follow up with Portland police to see if anyone had reported her missing. The official theory was that she'd somehow left the park undetected, maybe walking out to meet someone who'd picked her up on the main road. But that theory had problems. Why would she leave all her gear behind, including medications she clearly needed? Why leave her wallet and ID? And how would she have gotten her car out of the park without triggering the gate sensors? Deputy Williams filed it as a missing person case, but without any evidence of foul play, there wasn't much active investigation. Linda's campsite was cleared. Her belongings were stored at the ranger station in case she came back for them, and life went on. About 2 weeks later, I got a call from Linda's sister in Portland. She said Linda had been reported missing by her employer when she didn't show up for work on Monday. The sister confirmed that Linda had been planning a solo camping trip but hadn't mentioned where she was going. She asked if I could describe the last time I'd seen her sister. I told her about Linda waving to me from her campfire Wednesday evening, how normal and content she'd seemed. The sister asked about Linda's medications, said her sister was diabetic and needed to take insulin daily. That detail hit me hard. Those pills in the organizer weren't just regular medications. They were probably life-sustaining treatments. The sister drove out to collect Linda's belongings. When she saw the pill organizer, she confirmed that Linda would never voluntarily go anywhere without her medications. She said Linda was extremely careful about her health, always carried backup supplies, never missed doses. That conversation stayed with me for weeks. I kept thinking about Linda sitting by her fire that Wednesday evening, looking peaceful and settled. Then 12 hours later, her tent collapsed, her car somehow gone, and all her essential belongings left behind like she'd simply evaporated. I started paying more attention to the gate logs after that, cross-referencing them with my own observations of who was coming and going. The system worked perfectly. Every vehicle that passed through was recorded with accurate timestamps and direction of travel. There were no gaps, no glitches, no unexplained failures, which meant Linda Marsh's car had never left Cedar Lake State Park. I requested copies of the gate logs from that week and went through them multiple times. Her Honda Civic was logged entering at 5:27 Wednesday evening. No corresponding exit log existed, but the car was gone. I even walked the entire perimeter of the park, looking for places where someone might drive a vehicle out without passing through the main gate. The park is surrounded by dense forest and steep terrain. There are no roads, no driveways, no way to get a car out except through the entrance where the sensors are installed. Linda Marsh was never found. The case remains open, but with no new evidence or leads, it's essentially cold. Her sister calls me every few months to see if anything new has turned up. I always have to tell her no. What bothers me most isn't the mystery of where Linda went. People disappear sometimes, even from places that seem safe and controlled. What bothers me is the impossibility of how she left. A car doesn't just vanish from a state park. Electronic systems don't develop convenient blind spots. Essential medications don't get abandoned by people who need them to survive. I still work Site 23, still walk past it during my evening rounds. Sometimes I think about Linda sitting by her fire that last night, reading her book, looking like someone who'd found exactly the kind of peace she was looking for. I wonder if she had any idea that by morning, it would be like she'd never been there at all. The new gate system we installed last year has even more sophisticated sensors and backup logging systems. It records license plates, timestamps, everything twice, and stores data for 10 years instead of 1. The park supervisor said it was a routine upgrade, part of modernizing our security infrastructure. But I know the real reason we upgraded. Because sometimes the old system let people disappear, and nobody could explain how. And even though the new system is supposed to be foolproof, I still check the logs more carefully than I used to, just in case someone else decides to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only questions and a collapsed tent with all their worldly possessions still inside. I'm Diana. I've been the facilities manager for Willow Creek State Park for 11 years now, and I run a pretty tight operation. We maintain 43 buildings across 800 acres, from visitor centers to maintenance sheds to restroom facilities scattered throughout the trail system. Every repair request, every work order, every maintenance schedule goes through me. I know our systems inside and out. Our work order system is straightforward enough. Staff members submit requests through our online portal. The system assigns a work order number, and I prioritize and schedule the work based on urgency and available resources. We get maybe 20 to 30 requests per week during busy season. Broken toilets, leaky roofs, damaged picnic tables, the usual wear and tear that comes with thousands of visitors using park facilities every year. The system has been running smoothly since we digitized everything in 2018. Clear paper trail, proper documentation, efficient workflow. At least it was running smoothly until the fall of 2019. That's when we demolished the old restroom facility at Crow's Nest Trailhead. The building had been there since the park opened in 1987. A basic concrete block structure with 2 single-occupancy restrooms and a small utility closet. Nothing fancy, but it served its purpose for over 30 years. By 2019, though, it had developed serious foundation problems. Cracks in the walls, floor settling, plumbing issues that would have cost more to fix than building a replacement. The demolition was scheduled for October. Standard procedure. We had the utilities disconnected, hired a contractor with proper permits, and cleared the site for removal. The new facility was going to be built about 50 yards closer to the main trail, better positioned and more accessible. The contractor started breaking up the foundation on a Tuesday morning. That's when they found the bones. Not animal bones. The contractor called us immediately, and we contacted the county sheriff's office. They sent out a forensics team, and within a few hours, we had the state archaeologist on site as well. The bones were old, possibly decades old, and they were human. The demolition was suspended while investigators did their work. The archaeologist determined that the remains were likely from a single individual, probably buried sometime in the 1970s or early 80s before the park was established. No evidence of recent criminal activity, just old bones that had been there when the original restroom was built on top of them. After a week of investigation, the remains were removed for proper burial, and we got clearance to complete the demolition. The contractor finished breaking up the foundation, hauled away the debris, and left us with a clean gravel pad where the building used to be. We planted grass seed and installed a small trail marker indicating the site of the future restroom facility. The first work order came in 3 weeks later. Work order number 4789-November-01. Request to repair leaking faucet in men's restroom at Crow's Nest Trailhead. Filed by T. Morrison, maintenance staff. Routine request. Nothing unusual about the wording or the problem described, except there was no restroom at Crow's Nest Trailhead anymore, and we don't have anyone named T. Morrison on our maintenance staff. I checked our employee database twice. No T. Morrison, no Thomas Morrison, no Timothy or Terry, or any variation I could think of. I called our human resources office to see if maybe someone had been hired recently and not updated in my system. No record of anyone by that name. I assumed it was some kind of data entry error. Maybe a request that had been stuck in the system from before the demolition and finally processed. Our computer systems aren't perfect, and occasionally we get duplicate or delayed submissions. I marked the work order as completed, with a note that the facility had been demolished. The second work order came in the following week. Work order number 4803-November-08. Request to repair broken toilet in women's restroom at Crow's Nest Trailhead. Filed by T. Morrison, maintenance staff. This time I was more careful about checking the submission details. The work order had been filed at 2:37 a.m. on a Tuesday, submitted through our official portal using valid login credentials for T. Morrison. The system showed an active employee account with standard maintenance staff permissions, but T. Morrison didn't exist. I called our IT department to report what looked like a security breach. Someone had apparently created a fake employee account and was using it to submit bogus work orders. The IT technician, a young guy named Kevin, logged into the system remotely and walked me through T. Morrison's account details. The account had been created on October 15, 2019, 3 days before the demolition was completed. The account had valid employee identification numbers, a Park Service email address, and all the proper credentials for submitting maintenance requests. According to the system, T. Morrison was a Level 2 maintenance technician with 5 years of service. Kevin said he'd never seen anything like it. The account hadn't been created through normal channels, but it had all the proper authorizations and database entries. It was as if Morrison had always been an employee, except that no one had ever heard of him. We deactivated the account immediately and changed the system passwords as a precaution. Kevin ran a full security audit to see if there were any other unauthorized accounts or suspicious activity. Everything else checked out clean. The third work order came in 2 days later. Same format, same location, same non-existent employee. This time requesting repair of a broken door lock at Crow's Nest Trailhead restroom. Kevin swore the T. Morrison account was still deactivated, but somehow another work order had been submitted with valid credentials and a new work order number. I drove out to Crow's Nest Trailhead that afternoon to see the site for myself. The gravel pad where the restroom used to be was just that, an empty patch of ground with new grass growing around the edges. No building, no foundation, no infrastructure of any kind. Just a small wooden sign indicating future construction. But standing there, looking at that empty space, I found myself thinking about the specific repair requests we'd been receiving. Leaking faucet, broken toilet, damaged door lock. Those were exactly the kinds of problems the old restroom had been having before we demolished it. Problems that had been documented in our maintenance logs from 2018 and early 2019. Over the next month, we received 8 more work orders for the Crow's Nest Trailhead restroom. Different problems each time, but always routine maintenance issues. Always filed by T. Morrison. Always for a building that no longer existed. Kevin escalated the issue to the State IT Security Office. They sent a specialist to investigate our systems and found no evidence of hacking or unauthorized access. According to their analysis, the work orders were being generated through legitimate channels by an employee account that should not exist but apparently did. The security specialist suggested that maybe we had some kind of legacy data corruption, old records from a former employee named Morrison, that were somehow generating automatic work orders. But our employment records only went back to 2010, and we'd never had anyone by that name on staff. In December, I decided to research the history of the Crow's Nest Trailhead site. I wanted to understand what had been there before the park was established. Maybe find some connection to explain the strange work orders we were receiving. The park was created in 1985 on land that had previously been part of a private timber operation. Before that, the area had been mostly undeveloped forest, with a few scattered homesteads dating back to the early 1900s. I found some old county records that mentioned a small logging camp in the vicinity during the 1920s, but nothing specific about the exact location where we'd built the restroom. What I did find was an obituary from 1978. Thomas Morrison, age 34, died in a construction accident while working on a building project in the area that would later become Willow Creek State Park. The obituary mentioned that he was survived by a wife and 2 children, and that he had been employed as a maintenance worker for a local construction company. I showed the obituary to Kevin, and we compared the dates. Thomas Morrison had died in 1978. The archaeologist had estimated that the bones we found under the restroom foundation were from the 1970s or early 80s. The first work order from T. Morrison had been submitted 3 weeks after we discovered and removed those remains. Kevin said it was probably just a coincidence. Morrison is a common enough name, and the timing could be explained by data corruption or some other technical issue. But he also admitted that our security audit hadn't found any logical explanation for how the work orders were being generated. The requests continued through the winter and into the spring. Always routine maintenance problems. Always for the demolished restroom. Always filed by T. Morrison. I stopped trying to investigate them and just marked each one as completed, with a note about the facility no longer existing. But I also started keeping copies of every work order in a separate file, documenting the dates and details of each request. Something about the persistence of the requests bothered me. They weren't random or chaotic. They followed the pattern of normal maintenance issues for an aging facility, as if someone was still working there, still noticing problems, still dutifully reporting them through proper channels. In June of 2020, we finally built the new restroom facility at Crow's Nest Trailhead. Modern construction, ADA compliant, positioned closer to the main trail for better access. The work orders for the old location stopped the day the new building opened. I transferred to a different park in 2021. Took a promotion managing facilities across 3 parks instead of just 1. Before I left, I gave my replacement, Janet, a briefing on all our major systems and ongoing projects. I mentioned the T. Morrison work orders as a minor technical glitch that had been resolved when the new restroom opened. Janet called me last month with a question about our work order system. She said she'd been getting some unusual requests for maintenance on facilities that didn't match her records. When I asked for details, she said someone named T. Morrison had been submitting work orders for the old visitor center that was demolished in 2015, 3 years before I'd even started working at Willow Creek. I told Janet about my experience with the Crow's Nest restroom requests, about the bones we'd found during demolition, about the obituary for Thomas Morrison. She listened quietly and said she'd do some research of her own. A week later, Janet called back. She'd found records of other demolished buildings at the park, facilities that had been removed over the years as the park expanded and modernized. And she'd found more obituaries, more construction workers who had died in accidents around the area over the decades. She asked if I thought there might be a connection between the work orders and the old burial sites, places where the park had unknowingly built over unmarked graves. I told her I didn't know, that some questions don't have answers you can put in a maintenance report, but I also told her to keep documenting everything, to maintain good records of the unusual requests she received. Because even if we couldn't explain why someone who didn't exist was filing work orders for buildings that weren't there anymore, it was still our job to keep track of what was happening in our facilities. Even the facilities that only existed in the memory of someone who had been trying to maintain them for over 40 years. I'm Jake. I've been working as a wildlife technician at Redwood Valley State Park for 7 years now, mostly handling animal surveys, habitat monitoring, and maintaining our research equipment. It's detail-oriented work that suits me fine, tracking migration patterns, documenting species populations, making sure our data collection stays consistent year after year. Part of my job involves managing our storage facilities, the various sheds and outbuildings where we keep equipment, research materials, and archived data. We have 3 storage sheds scattered around the park, holdovers from different eras of park management. Most contain the usual assortment of field equipment, old signage, and boxes of paperwork that nobody's gotten around to digitizing. In March of 2023, I was tasked with cleaning out Storage Shed C, the oldest of our 3 facilities. It sits about half a mile behind the main visitor center, a weathered wooden building that hasn't been properly organized in probably 15 years. My supervisor wanted everything cataloged and either properly archived or disposed of, part of a park-wide effort to modernize our record-keeping. The shed was packed with decades' worth of accumulated material, boxes of paper files, old research equipment, camping gear that had seen better days, and the random odds and ends that accumulate when people have a place to store things they might need someday. I spent the better part of a week sorting through everything, making lists, and deciding what was worth keeping. That's when I found the photo boxes. They were stacked in the back corner, behind a pile of decommissioned trail markers and some old camping tables. 4 cardboard boxes, the kind you'd use for storing documents, each one labeled with a range of years in faded black marker: 1978 to 1985, 1986 to 1993, 1994 to 2001, 2002 to 2009. I figured they were probably old promotional photos or documentation of park events, the kind of thing parks keep for historical purposes. Each box was filled with Polaroid photographs, hundreds of them, most still in decent condition despite their age. The photos were loose, not organized in any particular order that I could determine. The first few photos I looked at seemed normal enough. Families at various locations around the park, the picnic area, the main trail overlook, the wooden bridge that crosses Miller Creek. Standard vacation photos, the kind people take to remember their visits. Nothing unusual about them. But as I went through more of the photos, I started noticing something odd about the compositions. A family of 4 standing in front of the park entrance sign. Dad on the left, Mom on the right, 2 kids in the middle. The father had his hand on the older child's shoulder. The mother was pointing toward the sign, and both kids were smiling at the camera. It was a nice photo, the kind any family might take. Then I found another photo of a different family in exactly the same pose. Different people, different clothes, clearly taken in a different decade based on the hairstyles and fashion. But they were standing in precisely the same positions. The father's hand on the child's shoulder at the same angle. The mother pointing at the sign with the same gesture. The children arranged identically. I set both photos aside and kept looking through the box. Within 20 minutes, I had found 6 more photos of different families at the park entrance sign, all in exactly the same pose. Different years, different people, but identical compositions down to the smallest details. I started checking photos from other locations. Same pattern. Families at the Miller Creek Bridge, always standing in the same spots. Always with the same arrangement of people. Always with the same gestures and expressions. Families at the picnic area, arranged around the same table in identical configurations. Families on the main trail overlook, positioned exactly the same way, with the same pointing gestures toward the same vista. The clothing styles and photo quality helped me date the pictures across several decades. Some were clearly from the 1970s and 80s, with the faded colors and square format of older Polaroid film. Others were more recent, with the sharper clarity of newer instant cameras. But regardless of when they were taken, the poses were identical. I spent the rest of the day going through all 4 boxes systematically, organizing the photos by location and comparing compositions. The pattern held across hundreds of photographs, spanning over 30 years. Different families, different time periods, but exact repetition of poses, gestures, and positioning. What disturbed me most was the lighting. In every set of photos from the same location, the shadows fell in exactly the same direction and had the same length, regardless of when the photo was taken. The lighting on people's faces was identical. The sun appeared to be in precisely the same position in the sky, even in photos that were obviously taken decades apart. I'm not a professional photographer, but I know enough about outdoor photography to understand that lighting changes constantly. The angle of the sun varies by season, by time of day, by weather conditions. You can't take photos at the same location years apart and have identical shadows and lighting unless they were taken at exactly the same time of day, on the same date, under identical weather conditions. But these photos spanned 4 decades. I brought the boxes back to my office and started documenting what I'd found. I scanned representative samples from each location and time period, creating digital files that I could compare more easily. The more I analyzed them, the more precise the repetition became. Not just the same general poses, but exact positioning down to finger placement and facial expressions. Not just similar lighting, but identical shadows cast at precisely the same angles. Even the background elements were consistent. The same clouds in the sky, the same patterns of light and shadow on trees and buildings. I showed my findings to my supervisor, Dr. Martinez, who oversees our wildlife research programs. She was as puzzled as I was by the photos. She suggested that maybe they were part of some kind of long-term study or documentation project, possibly related to park visitor research or promotional materials. But we couldn't find any records of such a project. No research permits, no budget allocations, no mentions in any of our archived reports or correspondence. The photos existed in our storage shed, but there was no institutional memory of why they were there or who had taken them. Dr. Martinez suggested I contact some of the retired park staff who might remember something about the photos. I reached out to 3 former employees who had worked at the park during different periods covered by the photos. None of them recalled any systematic photography project or had any explanation for the consistent poses and lighting. One of the retirees, a former ranger named Bill Henderson who had worked here in the 1980s and 90s, did remember something strange about visitor behavior at certain locations. He said families would sometimes ask him to take their photos at specific spots, and they would give very detailed instructions about how to position everyone and when to take the shot. Bill said it had seemed odd at the time because the families would be very insistent about the exact positioning, like they were trying to recreate a photo they'd seen before. He'd assumed they were copying poses from park brochures or promotional materials, but he'd never seen any official photos that matched what they were asking for. I started carrying some of the photos with me during my regular rounds, comparing them to the actual locations where they were taken. The spots were all easily accessible, popular places where families naturally tend to take pictures during their visits. Nothing remote or unusual about any of them. But standing at each location with the photos in hand, I noticed something that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite define. The viewpoints and angles used in the photos weren't the natural positions most people would choose for taking pictures. They were slightly off, positioned in ways that felt awkward or forced. At the Miller Creek Bridge, for example, the photos showed families standing at the far end, where the lighting is harsh and the background is less scenic. Most visitors naturally gravitate toward the center of the bridge, where the view is better and the photo opportunities are more appealing. At the main overlook, the photos showed people positioned away from the scenic railing, standing in an area where the view is partially obstructed by trees. Again, not where most people would naturally choose to take a picture. It was as if the photos were being taken from predetermined positions that prioritize something other than creating good family pictures. I started paying attention to current visitors at these locations, watching how they naturally behaved when taking photos. Families would arrive at these spots and initially position themselves in the obvious scenic location. Then, occasionally, I'd see them move to the exact positions shown in the old Polaroids, as if someone had given them specific instructions. When I asked a few families about their photo choices, they said other visitors had recommended those particular spots and poses. They'd been told those positions created the best pictures, even though they didn't necessarily look like the most appealing options. But when I asked who had made these recommendations, the families couldn't provide clear descriptions, usually just another family or some other visitors who had suggested the poses. Never anyone they could identify specifically or describe in detail. I created a map of all the photo locations and started monitoring them more systematically during my daily rounds. Over the course of several months, I documented dozens of instances where families moved from natural photo positions to the exact spots and poses shown in the archived Polaroids. The behavior seemed to be somehow transmitted from one group of visitors to another, but I could never identify a clear source or pattern for how the information was being shared. Dr. Martinez suggested I present my findings at our annual research conference. As an example of interesting visitor behavior patterns that might warrant further study, I prepared a presentation showing the photo comparisons, the location mapping, and my observations of current visitor behavior. But the night before the conference, I was going through the photos one more time to prepare my materials, and I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. In the background of several photos, barely visible among the trees or at the edges of the frame, there were partial figures of other people, not the main subjects of the photos, but other visitors who happened to be in the area when the pictures were taken. And in photos taken decades apart, some of those background figures appeared to be the same people. Same faces, same clothes, same ages, visible in photos spanning 20 or 30 years. People who should have aged or changed over time, but appeared identical across multiple decades. I canceled my conference presentation and spent the next week going through every photo with a magnifying glass, cataloging the background figures I could identify. The pattern was subtle but consistent. The same people appearing as background elements in photos taken years apart. Never aging, never changing. I've kept the photo boxes in my office since then. I've stopped trying to find logical explanations for what they show, and I've stopped monitoring the locations where they were taken. Some patterns don't have explanations that fit into research reports or scientific presentations. But I still think about those families, positioning themselves in awkward spots to recreate poses they can't quite explain, following recommendations from other visitors they can't clearly remember, creating new photos that match the lighting and shadows of pictures taken decades before they ever visited the park. And I wonder who's been taking all those pictures, documenting the same poses in the same locations with the same impossible lighting, year after year, for over 40 years. The boxes are still in my office. I haven't shown them to my replacement when I transfer next month. Some discoveries are better left for people to make on their own when they're ready to start asking questions that might not have answers they want to hear. I'm Carmen. I've been working as a geological survey technician in the Pacific Northwest for 12 years now, mostly doing slope stability assessments and post-disaster evaluations for the Forest Service and various state parks. It's technical work that requires attention to detail and a healthy respect for what mountains can do when they decide to move. Rock slides are part of the natural cycle in this region. Heavy rains, freeze-thaw cycles, and gradual erosion eventually cause sections of slope to give way. Most slides are small, just a few cubic yards of rock and soil shifting downhill. Occasionally, we get bigger events that can damage trails, block creeks, or threaten infrastructure. The Miller Creek slide happened on a Tuesday morning in February of 2022. A park ranger called it in around 10 a.m., reporting that a section of slope above the backcountry trail had come down overnight, blocking the creek and creating a debris dam that might cause flooding upstream. I drove out that afternoon to assess the situation and determine what kind of cleanup would be needed. The slide wasn't particularly large as these things go. Maybe 200 cubic yards of material that had broken away from a steep bank about 40 feet above the creek. Typical winter event, probably triggered by the heavy rains we'd been having. The debris had indeed dammed Miller Creek, creating a small pond that was already backing water up into the surrounding forest. Nothing immediately dangerous, but it would need to be cleared before spring. Snowmelt increased the water flow and created real flooding problems. I spent about an hour documenting the slide area, taking photos and measurements, noting the types of rock and soil that had come down. Standard procedure for determining the best approach to restoration. The material was mostly decomposed granite and forest duff. Relatively easy to work with once we got equipment to the site. That's when I noticed something odd in the debris field. About halfway down the slope, partially buried under rocks and soil, I could see what looked like fabric. Bright blue material that definitely wasn't natural to the forest environment. I climbed carefully up the debris pile to get a closer look, testing each step to make sure the slope was stable. The fabric turned out to be part of a tent. Not just any tent, but an older style that I recognized from camping gear catalogs from the 1980s. The kind of heavy canvas construction that outdoor enthusiasts used before lightweight synthetic materials became standard. The tent was partially collapsed and buried, but enough was visible to see that it was completely intact. I cleared away some of the loose debris and found more camping equipment. A sleeping bag in a stuff sack, also showing the design and materials typical of older gear. A small backpack, again with the styling and construction details that placed it decades in the past. Everything was in remarkably good condition, considering it had apparently been buried under several feet of soil and rock for an extended period. The gear was arranged as if someone had been camping at that spot and then simply walked away, leaving everything behind. The tent was set up properly. The sleeping bag was laid out inside, and personal items were scattered around in the casual way people arrange their belongings when they're settled in for the night. What didn't make sense was the location. The spot where I found the campsite was on a steep slope, maybe 30 degrees of incline, covered with loose rock and unstable soil. Nobody in their right mind would set up camp there. It was dangerous terrain, prone to slides and rockfall, with no level ground and no access to water. But the camping gear was definitely arranged as if someone had made camp at that exact spot. I took photos of everything and continued my assessment of the slide area. The more I looked at the situation, the more puzzled I became. The camping gear had clearly been buried for a long time. The soil layers above it showed normal forest succession, with established root systems and organic matter that takes years to develop. Yet the gear itself looked almost new. No significant decay, no water damage, no signs of the deterioration you'd expect from decades of burial in forest soil. I finished my initial survey and was preparing to hike back to my truck when I noticed the boot prints. They were in a patch of soft mud near the creek, about 50 yards downhill from where I'd found the camping gear. Fresh prints, clearly defined, showing the tread pattern of modern hiking boots. The prints led away from the slide area, following the creek downstream toward the main trail. The mud was from yesterday's rain, still soft and impressionable. The prints had been made recently, probably within the last 12 hours, but they appeared to originate from the area where the camping gear had been buried, as if someone had walked down from the slide zone to the creek and then continued downstream. I followed the prints for about a quarter mile, before they disappeared on rockier ground near the main trail junction. They showed a normal walking gait, nothing hurried or distressed about the pattern, just someone hiking at a steady pace toward the trailhead. I contacted my supervisor to report what I'd found and got authorization to bring in a small crew to properly excavate the camping gear. We returned 2 days later with proper archaeological tools and documentation equipment, treating the site like a potential historical discovery. The excavation revealed the full extent of the campsite. Along with the tent and sleeping bag, we found a camp stove, cooking utensils, food containers, and personal items including clothing and toiletries. Everything was arranged in a normal camping layout, as if the occupant had simply stepped away temporarily. Most of the gear bore manufacturer labels and design features that clearly dated it to the early 1980s. Some items had visible wear patterns showing they'd been used regularly, but overall, everything was in excellent condition, far better condition than you'd expect from gear that had been buried in forest soil for 30 or 40 years. We found no identification, no personal papers, nothing that would indicate who had been camping there or when they'd left. The food containers were empty, and any perishable items had long since decomposed. But the durable gear looked like it could be packed up and used for camping today. I sent photos and samples to a forensics lab for analysis, hoping to get more precise dating information. The lab confirmed that the materials and manufacturing techniques were consistent with early 1980s outdoor equipment. Soil analysis from the burial layers indicated the gear had been covered for at least 25 years, possibly longer. But the lab also found something puzzling. Trace amounts of modern synthetic materials mixed with the older gear, fibers, and chemical residues that didn't match the age of the main items, as if someone with contemporary equipment had been at the site recently. I returned to the slide area several more times over the following weeks, partly for my official assessment work and partly to try to understand what I'd found. Each visit, I looked for more boot prints or signs of recent activity, but the area remained undisturbed except for our excavation work. The park rangers had no records of missing campers from the 1980s that matched the location or time frame. No reports of abandoned equipment, no search and rescue operations in that area during the relevant period. The campsite seemed to exist without any corresponding incident or missing person case. What bothered me most was the fresh boot prints. They clearly originated from the slide area, from the exact spot where the buried camping gear had been uncovered. But how could someone walk away from a campsite that had been buried for decades? And why would those prints be fresh when the campsite itself was obviously old? I started researching the history of the Miller Creek area, looking for any incidents or disappearances that might explain the buried campsite. The area had been part of the National Forest System since the 1960s, with established trails and regular ranger patrols. There were records of occasional search and rescue operations, but nothing that matched what I'd found. In the Park Service archives, I did find a missing person report from September of 1983. A solo hiker named David Chen had failed to return from a planned 3-day backpacking trip in the Miller Creek area. Search teams had covered the main trails and obvious camping spots, but never found any trace of him or his equipment. The description of Chen's gear in the missing person report matched several items we'd excavated from the slide site. Same brand tent, same style sleeping bag, same model backpack. The timing was right, and the location was within the area where Chen had planned to hike. But that still didn't explain the fresh boot prints leading away from the buried campsite. I submitted my final report on the Miller Creek slide in April, recommending standard debris removal and creek restoration procedures. I included a separate section documenting the archaeological discovery, but I didn't mention the fresh boot prints. Some observations don't fit into official reports, especially when you can't explain them in ways that make sense to people who weren't there. The cleanup crew removed the slide debris and restored normal flow to Miller Creek over the course of a week. The camping gear was cataloged and stored at the park headquarters, available for retrieval if anyone ever came forward to claim it. I've driven past the Miller Creek trailhead dozens of times since then, and I always find myself looking toward the slide area, wondering about David Chen and his decades-old campsite, wondering how someone could walk away from gear that had been buried since the Reagan administration, leaving fresh prints in yesterday's mud. The official story is that we found some old camping equipment uncovered by a routine rock slide, probably belonging to a hiker who went missing in the 1980s. The equipment was preserved by unusual soil conditions and has been properly archived for potential future identification. That's the story that goes in the reports and gets filed with the appropriate agencies. It's a reasonable explanation that accounts for most of the facts and doesn't raise uncomfortable questions about impossible chronologies or fresh tracks leading away from buried campsites. But I still think about those boot prints sometimes, especially when I'm working other slide sites in the area. I find myself looking more carefully at what gets uncovered when mountains decide to move, paying attention to things that might not belong to the time period when they got buried. Because if David Chen walked away from his campsite in 1983 and left fresh prints in 2022, then maybe time works differently in some places than we think it does. Maybe some people don't stay missing the way we expect them to. Or maybe mountains keep their own records of what happened in the forest. And sometimes they decide to share those records with whoever happens to be there when the rocks start falling. I'm Mitchell. I've been coordinating volunteer programs at Pine Ridge State Park for 8 years now, managing everything from trail maintenance crews to visitor-centered docents. It's rewarding work that brings together people who want to give back to the park system. And over the years, I've worked with hundreds of volunteers from all walks of life. Most volunteers are retirees looking for meaningful ways to spend their time, or college students earning community service credits. Some are locals who grew up hiking these trails and want to help maintain them. Others are newcomers to the area who see volunteering as a way to learn about their new environment. What they all have in common is a genuine desire to contribute to something larger than themselves. Trail maintenance is one of our most popular volunteer programs. The work is physical but not overly demanding, and volunteers can see the immediate impact of their efforts. We provide basic training in proper techniques, supply all the necessary tools, and assign volunteers to sections of trail that match their skill level and physical capabilities. Sarah Martinez started volunteering with our trail maintenance program in June of 2023. She filled out all the paperwork properly, provided references, and passed the background check that all volunteers undergo. Her application listed her as recently retired from a career in environmental consulting, interested in outdoor work that would keep her active and engaged with conservation efforts during her orientation. Sarah struck me as exactly the kind of volunteer we hope to attract. She was knowledgeable about forestry and trail construction, physically fit for someone in her early 60s, and genuinely enthusiastic about the work. She asked intelligent questions during training and demonstrated good judgment about safety procedures and environmental protection. I assigned Sarah to work on the Oak Loop Trail System, a moderate difficulty area that needed regular maintenance but wasn't too challenging for someone getting back into physical labor. She was scheduled to work 1 day per week, Thursdays, for a 2-month commitment that would take her through the end of August. Sarah exceeded my expectations from the very beginning. She arrived precisely at 8 a.m. every Thursday, worked diligently until 4 p.m., and completed more in a single day than most volunteers accomplished in 2. Her work was professional quality. Properly graded trail surfaces, well-built drainage features, and careful attention to minimizing environmental impact. More importantly, Sarah was a pleasure to work with. She was friendly with other volunteers, helpful to visitors she encountered on the trails, and consistently positive about even the more tedious aspects of trail maintenance. Other volunteers specifically requested to work with her, and I started using her as an informal mentor for new people joining the program. By the end of July, I was hoping Sarah would consider extending her volunteer commitment beyond the original 2 months. She was reliable, skilled, and had become an integral part of our trail maintenance team. When I brought up the possibility of continued involvement, She said she'd think about it, but seemed genuinely interested in staying on. Sarah's last scheduled day was Thursday, August 24th. I didn't see her that morning because I was dealing with an equipment delivery at the visitor center. But her crew leader, Tom, said she'd arrived on time as usual and headed out to work on a section of trail near the overlook. When the crew returned to the tool shed at the end of the day, Tom mentioned that Sarah had left early without saying goodbye. That seemed unusual for her. She was normally very social and always checked in with the crew leader before heading home. But people sometimes have personal matters that come up, and I didn't think much of it at the time. What I did find odd was the report Tom gave me about Sarah's work area that day. According to Tom, Sarah had been assigned to clear drainage ditches along a half-mile section of trail, routine maintenance that involved removing accumulated debris and reshaping the water channels. When he hiked out to check on her progress in the afternoon, he found that the work had been completed to her usual high standards. But Sarah's tools were arranged in a perfect circle around an old tree stump, about 10 feet off the trail. Not scattered or dropped, but deliberately placed in a precise geometric pattern. Hand tools, measuring tape, work gloves, water bottle, everything positioned at equal distances around the stump like some kind of ritual arrangement. Tom said it looked almost ceremonial, like someone had taken great care to create a specific pattern with the tools. He'd never seen anything like it in 20 years of trail work. He gathered up the equipment and brought it back to the shed, figuring Sarah had just found an unusual way to organize her gear before leaving. I made a note to ask Sarah about the tool arrangement when she came in to collect her final paycheck. Volunteers typically stop by the office within a week or two of completing their service to handle paperwork and get their volunteer appreciation certificate. But Sarah never came in. After 2 weeks, I called the phone number on her volunteer application. No answer, and the voicemail box was full. I tried her email address and got an automated response saying the account was no longer active. Both contact methods that had worked perfectly throughout her 2 months of service were suddenly non-functional. I checked with Tom and the other volunteers who had worked with Sarah, thinking maybe she'd mentioned moving or traveling. Nobody recalled her saying anything about plans that would prevent her from collecting her paycheck or completing the standard exit process. After a month of no contact, I decided to try reaching Sarah's emergency contact, a woman named Lisa Martinez, who was listed as her sister. Sarah's volunteer file included a phone number for Lisa, along with a note that she lived in Sacramento and should be contacted if Sarah was injured or became ill while volunteering. Lisa answered on the second ring. When I explained that I was calling about Sarah's volunteer work at Pine Ridge State Park, there was a long silence before Lisa asked me to repeat what I'd said. I went through the details again. Sarah's 2 months of trail maintenance work, her excellent performance, the fact that we hadn't heard from her since her last day, and wanted to make sure she was all right. Lisa listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that made my stomach tighten. That's impossible. Sarah died in February. I've been handling her estate for 6 months. I asked Lisa to repeat what she'd said, thinking I'd misunderstood, or that we were talking about different people. But Lisa confirmed that her sister, Sarah Martinez, had passed away from complications related to cancer in February of 2023, 4 months before she'd started volunteering at our park. Lisa said Sarah had been in treatment for over a year and had been too sick to work or travel during the final months of her life. She died at a hospice facility in Sacramento, surrounded by family. Lisa had handled the funeral arrangements and was still working through the legal process of settling Sarah's estate. When I described the Sarah who had volunteered with us, her physical appearance, her environmental consulting background, her enthusiasm for trail work, Lisa confirmed that it sounded exactly like her sister. But she insisted that Sarah had been dead for 6 months. I asked Lisa if Sarah had any relatives or friends who might have used her name and credentials for some reason. Lisa said that was impossible. Sarah had been very private about her personal information, and her professional credentials had been returned to the relevant agencies after her death. After the call with Lisa, I spent several hours going through Sarah's volunteer file looking for inconsistencies or red flags that I might have missed during the application process. Everything appeared to be in order: proper identification, valid references, background check results that showed no criminal history. But if Lisa was telling the truth, then all of that documentation belonged to someone who had been dead for 4 months when the application was submitted. I contacted our background check service to verify Sarah's information. They confirmed that Sarah Martinez of Sacramento had a clean criminal history and had worked in environmental consulting, but they also noted that their records showed she was deceased as of February 2023. The background check company suggested that someone might have used Sarah's identity fraudulently, though they couldn't explain how the application had passed their verification process. Identity theft usually involves financial crimes, not volunteering for unpaid trail maintenance work. I reported the situation to park management and our legal department. They treated it as a potential security issue and launched an internal investigation. But the investigation raised more questions than it answered. Sarah's volunteer timesheet had been signed by Tom and other crew leaders every Thursday for 2 months. Multiple people had worked alongside her, eaten lunch with her, and could provide detailed descriptions of her appearance and personality. She had used park tools, driven her own vehicle to the work sites, and interacted normally with dozens of staff members and fellow volunteers. The security cameras at the park entrance showed Sarah's car arriving and leaving on schedule every Thursday. The license plate was clearly visible and matched the information in her volunteer file. But when we ran the plate number, it came back registered to Sarah Martinez of Sacramento, who had been dead for 6 months. Our legal department contacted the Sacramento police to report possible identity theft or fraud. The police were puzzled by the situation, but agreed to investigate. They confirmed that Sarah Martinez had died in February, and that her vehicle had been sold as part of her estate settlement in March. The car that showed up on our security cameras every Thursday belonged to someone who couldn't possibly have been driving it. The police investigation eventually concluded that while unusual, no actual crime had been committed. No money had been stolen, no fraud had been perpetrated, and no park resources had been misused. Someone using a dead person's identity to perform volunteer trail maintenance didn't fit any standard criminal categories. I kept Sarah's tools in my office for several months, thinking that whoever had been using her identity might eventually return for them. The tools were good quality, well maintained, the kind that represent a significant investment for someone who does regular trail work, but nobody ever came for them. I still have Sarah's volunteer file in my desk drawer. Photos from the volunteer appreciation picnic showing her working alongside other volunteers, all of whom remember her as a dedicated and skilled team member. Timesheets documenting 8 weeks of consistent, high-quality work. Reference letters from supervisors who praised her professionalism and work ethic. All the documentation of someone who, according to official records, couldn't have been there. Sometimes I drive past the section of Oak Loop Trail where Sarah did her last day of work, where Tom found her tools arranged in that perfect circle around the tree stump. The drainage work she completed that day is still holding up well, channeling water efficiently and preventing erosion just like it's supposed to. Professional quality work that will protect that section of trail for years to come. Work completed by someone who had been dead for 6 months when she picked up those tools and started digging. I don't have a good explanation for what happened with Sarah Martinez, but I learned that sometimes the most dedicated volunteers are the ones who keep showing up for work even when showing up should be impossible. The trail maintenance program continues, and we get new volunteers every season. Good people who want to contribute their time and effort to maintaining these mountain paths for future visitors. I coordinate their schedules, provide their training, and manage their projects just like I always have. But now I pay closer attention to the details in volunteer applications. I double-check references more carefully and verify information through multiple sources. Not because I'm afraid of more identity theft, but because I want to make sure I know who's actually showing up to work in our forests. Even though I'm beginning to suspect that sometimes we might not get to decide who shows up to help with the work that needs to be done. I'm Angela. I've been working as a communications dispatcher for the Forest Service for 15 years now, managing radio traffic for 6 ranger stations scattered across the Cascade Mountain region. It's precise work that requires attention to detail and the ability to stay calm during emergencies. But most days it's routine check-ins, weather updates, and coordination of maintenance schedules. Radio discipline is essential in our system. Every transmission follows established protocols with specific call signs, timing requirements, and documentation procedures. Rangers check in at scheduled intervals, report their status and location, and maintain contact throughout their shifts. The system has been refined over decades to ensure reliable communication across challenging mountain terrain. I know every station in our network by heart. Station 1 is headquarters, located at the main administrative complex. Stations 2 through 6 are remote outposts positioned at strategic locations throughout the forest, each staffed by rangers who cover specific patrol areas and maintain their own equipment and facilities. Station 7 used to be part of our network, positioned on a ridge overlooking the northern section of forest. It was a small facility, basically a cabin with radio equipment and emergency supplies, staffed by a single ranger who covered the most remote hiking trails and backcountry areas. The station provided an important communication relay for that region and served as a base for search and rescue operations. But Station 7 was destroyed in a landslide during the winter of 2018. Heavy rains had destabilized the slope above the station, and the entire facility was buried under several thousand tons of rock and debris. The ranger who had been assigned there, Jim Hendricks, was fortunately on leave at the time and wasn't injured. After the landslide, we decided not to rebuild Station 7. The cost would have been significant, and changes in our patrol patterns meant we could cover the area from other stations. Jim was reassigned to Station 4 for the remainder of his career, and he retired in 2021 after 32 years of service. All the radio equipment from Station 7 was either destroyed in the landslide or relocated to other facilities. The call sign was officially decommissioned, and the frequency was removed from our active rotation. For the past 5 years, Station 7 has existed only in our historical records. Until last month, the first transmission came in on a Tuesday morning in October, during the routine 8 a.m. check-in period, when all stations report their status for the day. I was logging the regular calls from Stations 1 through 6 when I heard a familiar voice on the frequency that used to belong to Station 7. Central Dispatch. This is Station 7 checking in. All systems normal. Weather clear. Beginning morning patrol. The voice was unmistakably Jim Hendricks. Same cadence, same slight rasp from years of mountain air, same professional delivery he'd used for thousands of radio calls during his career. But Jim had been retired for 3 years and was living in Florida, and Station 7 had been buried under tons of rock for even longer. I keyed my microphone and responded according to protocol, even though my hands were shaking slightly. Station 7, this is Central Dispatch. Please verify your location and call sign. There was a brief pause. Then Jim's voice came back clear and strong. Central Dispatch, Station 7. Located at Grid Reference November 7. 7 Alpha. All equipment functional. No issues to report. November 7. 7 Alpha was the correct grid reference for the old Station 7 location. But that location was now a pile of boulders and debris with no structures, no power, and certainly no radio equipment. I documented the transmission in my log and immediately called my supervisor, Karen Mills, to report what I'd heard. Karen listened to my account with obvious skepticism, then suggested that maybe someone with a portable radio was using the old call sign, possibly as some kind of prank or mistake. But when Karen checked the frequency logs and confirmed that the transmission had come through our official channels with the proper authentication codes, she became more concerned. Someone would need access to current encryption keys and frequency assignments to broadcast on our network, and that kind of access is tightly controlled. Over the next week, I received 3 more transmissions from Station 7. always during regular check-in periods, always using proper protocols, always in Jim Hendrick's voice. The transmissions included routine status reports, weather observations, and updates on patrol activities. Everything sounded completely normal, except that it was impossible. Karen contacted our technical services department to investigate potential radio equipment malfunctions or unauthorized transmissions. The technicians ran comprehensive tests on our communication system and found no evidence of tampering, interference, or unauthorized access. They also confirmed that the transmissions were definitely coming from the grid coordinates of the old Station 7 location. The signal, strength, and direction finding data all pointed to that specific site, which made no sense since there was no radio equipment there. I suggested that maybe we should send someone to physically check the Station 7 site, just to verify that there really was nothing there. Karen agreed, and she assigned Ranger Martinez from Station 4 to hike out and investigate. Martinez returned with photos and a detailed report. The landslide site showed no signs of recent activity, no radio equipment, no structures, no indication that anyone had been there recently. Just rocks, debris, and the sparse vegetation that had started growing over the slide area in the past 5 years. But Martinez also noted something odd in his report. While he was at the site, he heard what sounded like radio static coming from somewhere beneath the debris pile. Brief bursts of white noise that seemed to follow a pattern, like someone was keying a microphone without speaking. The static stopped when Martinez tried to locate its source, and he couldn't reproduce the sounds or determine where they might have been coming from. After Martinez's site visit, the transmissions from Station 7 became more frequent. Instead of just the routine check-ins, I started receiving regular status updates throughout the day. Jim would report on weather conditions, wildlife observations, and trail maintenance needs, just like he used to do when Station 7 was operational. The content of his reports was always professional and appropriate. He described typical ranger activities, checking trail markers, monitoring campgrounds, documenting wildlife sightings. Nothing dramatic or unusual, just the routine duties that rangers perform every day. But the locations he reported didn't match current park conditions. Jim would mention checking facilities that had been demolished years ago, or report trail conditions on paths that had been permanently closed. His weather observations sometimes contradicted what our other stations were reporting from the same general area. It was as if Jim was working in a version of the forest that existed several years in the past, before Station 7 was destroyed and before various changes had been made to park infrastructure. I started keeping detailed records of all transmissions from Station 7, documenting the time, content, and circumstances of each call. The pattern was consistent. Regular check-ins and status reports delivered in Jim's voice, always using proper radio protocols, always from the location of the buried station. Karen decided we needed to contact Jim directly to find out if he had any knowledge of the transmissions. She tracked down his phone number in Florida and called him to ask about the situation. Jim was genuinely puzzled by Karen's questions. He confirmed that he was retired and living in Florida, that he had no access to Forest Service radio equipment, and that he hadn't been in contact with anyone from our region since his retirement party 3 years ago. When Karen described the radio transmissions and played him a recording of one of the calls, Jim confirmed that it sounded like his voice, but he insisted that he hadn't made any radio transmissions and had no explanation for what we were hearing. Jim also mentioned something that made the situation even more unsettling. He said that lately he'd been having very vivid dreams about his old job, dreams where he was back at Station 7 performing his regular duties. The dreams were so realistic that sometimes he woke up confused about where he was, expecting to see the mountains outside his window instead of the Florida suburb. After the call with Jim, Karen escalated the issue to regional headquarters. The unusual radio transmissions were now considered a potential security concern that required investigation by specialists with more advanced technical resources. A team of Federal Communications investigators arrived the following week to conduct a comprehensive analysis of our radio system. They brought sophisticated equipment to monitor transmissions, analyze signal sources, and detect any unauthorized broadcasting equipment. The investigators documented several transmissions from Station 7 during their week-long study. They confirmed that the signals were definitely originating from the coordinates of the destroyed station, and that the transmissions used correct authentication codes and followed proper protocols. But they found no radio equipment at the site, no power source that could operate such equipment, and no logical explanation for how the transmissions were being generated. The lead investigator, a specialist named Dr. Chen, told Karen that the case was unprecedented in his experience. The technical evidence clearly showed that someone was broadcasting from a location where no broadcast capability existed, using equipment that wasn't there. Dr. Chen's final report classified the transmissions as unexplained but not threatening to national security. He recommended continued monitoring but acknowledged that conventional investigation methods had reached their limits. The transmissions from Station 7 continue to this day. Jim checks in every morning, provides regular status updates, and follows all the communication protocols he learned during his 32 years of service. His reports describe a version of the forest that seems frozen in time, before the landslide that destroyed his station and ended his career. I've gotten used to hearing Jim's voice on the radio again, even though I know it's impossible. Other dispatchers who work different shifts have also logged transmissions from Station 7, so I know I'm not imagining things or suffering from some kind of breakdown. Sometimes, during quiet periods, when radio traffic is light, I find myself looking forward to Jim's check-ins. His voice is a reassuring presence, a reminder of the professionalism and dedication that rangers bring to their work, even in the most remote and challenging locations. But I also can't forget that Jim's station was buried under tons of rock 5 years ago, and that Jim himself is 3 time zones away, probably sitting by a swimming pool in Florida, having no idea that his voice is still echoing through our radio system every day. The Forest Service has updated our communication procedures to acknowledge transmissions from Station 7 without trying to respond or interfere with them. Officially, we log the calls as equipment anomalies and continue with normal operations. Unofficially, I think Jim is still doing his job, still maintaining his patrol area, still checking in with dispatch like a good ranger should. Some people are so dedicated to their work that they keep doing it even after circumstances make it impossible. And maybe some places hold on to their purpose so strongly that they keep operating even after they've been erased from the map. Maybe Station 7 is still out there in some way that our equipment can detect, but our eyes can't see. And Jim is still taking care of his section of forest like he did for 32 years. I hope he knows that someone is still listening, still logging his reports, still appreciating the work he does to keep the mountains safe, even if the mountains he's protecting exist only in radio transmissions from a station that isn't there anymore. I'm Dave. I've been operating heavy equipment for the National Park Service for 16 years now, mostly road maintenance and emergency cleanup work in the Olympic Mountains. It's honest work that keeps me outdoors and lets me use the skills I learned in construction before I moved to government service. When storms knock trees across park roads or when rock slides block access to popular areas, I'm usually one of the first people called to clear the damage. Hurricane Ridge Road is one of our major arteries, a winding mountain highway that climbs from the visitor center up to the alpine meadows and scenic overlooks that bring thousands of visitors to the park every year. The road follows an exposed route through some challenging terrain, and it's particularly vulnerable to storm damage during the winter months, when high winds and heavy precipitation can bring down trees and trigger landslides. The storm that hit in early November of 2023 was typical for the season. Sustained winds over 60 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 80. Not the worst we've seen, but strong enough to knock down trees and create hazardous conditions throughout the park. By the time the weather cleared, we had reports of blocked roads and damaged facilities across several areas. My supervisor, Tom Rodriguez, called me at 6:30 Thursday morning to let me know that Hurricane Ridge Road was impassable due to fallen trees. He said the overnight security patrol had reported multiple large trees down across the roadway, some requiring heavy equipment to clear. I was scheduled to take my skidder up there at first light to begin cleanup operations. This kind of storm damage is routine work for me. I've cleared hundreds of fallen trees over the years, and I know exactly what equipment to bring for different situations. For Hurricane Ridge Road, I loaded my truck with chainsaw equipment, rigging gear, and safety supplies, then headed up the mountain with the skidder on a trailer behind me. The drive to Hurricane Ridge normally takes about 45 minutes from the equipment yard, following a series of switchbacks that climb nearly 5,000 feet in elevation. During winter conditions, it can take longer, but the road was in decent shape that morning despite the previous night's storm. I expected to find several large trees blocking the road, probably Douglas firs and western hemlocks that had been weakened by previous storms and finally knocked down by the high winds. Based on the security patrol's report, I figured I was looking at a full day of cutting and clearing, maybe 2 days if some of the trees were particularly large or difficult to access. But when I reached the first reported blockage site, about halfway up the mountain, there was nothing there. No fallen trees, no debris, no sign that anything had ever blocked the road. The asphalt was clean, the shoulders were clear, and traffic could have passed through without any problem. I pulled over and checked my work order to make sure I was at the right location. According to the GPS coordinates Tom had given me, I was exactly where the security patrol had reported major tree damage. I continued up the road to the second blockage site, thinking maybe the patrol had made an error in their location reporting. But that site was also clear. Same story at the third and fourth sites. Clean roadway, no debris, no indication that there had ever been any obstruction. By the time I reached the Hurricane Ridge parking area at the top of the mountain, I was genuinely puzzled. The security patrol's report had described multiple large trees completely blocking the road, but every site was clear. Either the patrol had made a serious error or someone had already completed the cleanup work. I parked near the visitor center and walked back down the road to take a closer look at the areas where trees had supposedly fallen. That's when I started noticing the evidence of recent work. Fresh sawdust scattered along the road shoulders, cut marks on tree stumps where large branches had been removed, tire tracks from heavy equipment in the soft soil beside the asphalt. Someone had definitely been working here recently, and they'd done a professional job of clearing storm damage. But I could see that the work involved more than just moving fallen trees. Several large stumps showed evidence of being ground down flush with the ground, which requires specialized equipment that we don't normally bring to routine storm cleanup jobs. The cuts were clean and precise, the kind you see when experienced operators are working with sharp chains and proper technique. I followed the evidence of recent work for about half a mile, documenting what I found with photos and GPS coordinates. The cleanup had been thorough and professional, meeting all our standards for road maintenance and environmental protection. Debris had been cut to appropriate lengths, moved well clear of the roadway, and stacked in designated areas where it wouldn't impact drainage or create fire hazards. What really caught my attention was a blue thermos sitting on one of the freshly cut stumps. The thermos was a standard construction worker type, maybe 12 ounces, with a few dents and scratches that showed it had seen regular use. When I picked it up, I could feel that it was still warm. I unscrewed the top and found it was about half full of black coffee that was still steaming. Someone had been working at that exact spot recently enough that their coffee hadn't had time to cool down. I radioed Tom to report what I'd found and asked if he'd authorized another crew to work on Hurricane Ridge Road. Tom said he definitely hadn't scheduled anyone else, and that I was supposed to be the only operator assigned to storm cleanup that day. He suggested that maybe a contractor had been working in the area on some other project, though he couldn't think of any ongoing work that would require tree removal. I spent another hour documenting the site and looking for additional clues about who had done the work. I found tire tracks from what appeared to be a skidder similar to mine, along with boot prints that suggested a crew of 3 or 4 people. The tracks were fresh, probably made within the past few hours, based on how sharp the impressions were in the soft ground. But I found no equipment, no vehicles, and no workers anywhere in the area. Whoever had completed the cleanup had finished their work and left before I arrived. When I returned to the equipment yard that afternoon, Tom was waiting with a puzzled expression and a stack of paperwork. He'd spent the day trying to figure out who had authorized the Hurricane Ridge Road cleanup, checking with various departments and reviewing budget allocations. Nobody had any record of scheduling tree removal work on Hurricane Ridge Road. No purchase orders had been issued, no contractors had been hired, and no Park Service crews had been assigned to that area. According to all official records, the road should still have been blocked by fallen trees. Tom called the overnight security patrol to clarify their report from the previous night. The security officer, a guy named Martinez, who'd been working park security for 8 years, insisted that he'd driven Hurricane Ridge Road around midnight and found it completely impassable due to multiple large trees across the roadway. Martinez said he'd had to turn around at the first blockage, about halfway up the mountain, because a massive Douglas fir had fallen directly across both lanes. He'd noted the GPS coordinates carefully and estimated that the tree was at least 4 feet in diameter, far too large to move without heavy equipment. But when Tom asked Martinez to describe exactly what he'd seen, some details didn't match what I'd observed at the site. Martinez described the fallen tree as being oriented differently than the fresh stump I'd found, and he mentioned debris patterns that didn't align with the cleanup evidence. Tom decided to review the security patrol logs more carefully, looking for any inconsistencies or errors in reporting. What he found was puzzling. Martinez's written report from the previous night described impassable road conditions due to storm damage, but the report was filed at 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Martinez claimed to have driven up the mountain. When Tom questioned Martinez about the timing discrepancy, Martinez said he must have made an error in his paperwork, that he'd probably pre-written parts of his report and gotten confused about the exact timeline. But Martinez insisted that he'd definitely seen major tree damage blocking Hurricane Ridge Road. Tom escalated the situation to park management, treating it as a potential unauthorized work issue that needed investigation. Using contractors without proper authorization violates federal procurement regulations and could result in serious legal problems for the park. The investigation lasted 2 weeks and involved interviews with all relevant staff, reviews of budgets and contracts, and coordination with local tree service companies to see if anyone had been working in the park without authorization. Nobody found any evidence of unauthorized work. No contractors reported working in the park, no equipment rentals had been made, and no invoices existed for tree removal services. The work had definitely been completed, but there was no official record of who had done it or how it had been paid for. The investigation report concluded that the Hurricane Ridge Road cleanup had been completed by unknown parties using unknown resources, but that no park regulations had been violated since no payment had been made and no contracts had been executed. The report recommended improved coordination between security patrols and maintenance crews to prevent similar confusion in the future. I kept the blue thermos that I'd found on the stump, thinking that maybe someone would eventually claim it. It's still sitting on my workbench at home, a good quality thermos that somebody probably misses, but nobody has ever asked about it, and I've never figured out who it belongs to. Over the next few months, I started paying more attention to storm cleanup operations, looking for signs that work had been completed before I arrived at scheduled sites. It happened 3 more times that winter, sites where my work orders indicated major cleanup needs, but where I found evidence that someone had already completed professional quality work. Each time, the pattern was the same: no official record of who had done the work, no budget allocations for the services, and no contractors who admitted to working in those areas. Just clean, professional cleanup that met all our standards and left our roads safe for public use. I mentioned the pattern to Tom, who said he'd heard similar reports from other operators working different areas of the park. Apparently, unauthorized storm cleanup was becoming a recurring issue, but since the work was being done properly and nobody was billing the park for services, management wasn't treating it as a priority problem. Tom suggested that maybe we had some kind of Good Samaritan situation. Local contractors or retired Park Service employees who were volunteering their time and equipment to help with storm cleanup. He said that as long as the work met our standards and didn't create liability issues, the park was probably better off not looking too closely at who was providing free services. But that explanation has always bothered me. Professional tree removal requires expensive equipment, skilled operators, and significant time investments. Nobody volunteers that kind of work without some kind of recognition or documentation, especially not repeatedly across multiple storm events. I still do storm cleanup operations throughout the park, and I still occasionally arrive at sites where the work has already been completed by unknown crews. I've learned to document what I find, complete my reports accurately, and not ask too many questions about who's helping us keep the roads clear. But I also pay attention to the quality of the work, and it's always excellent. Professional standards, proper techniques, complete cleanup that protects both public safety and environmental resources. Whoever is doing this work knows what they're doing and takes pride in doing it right. Sometimes I wonder if there are people who care so much about keeping these mountain roads open that they'll do the work regardless of whether anyone official asks them to. People who understand that visitors need safe access to these beautiful places, and who are willing to provide that access even if they never get credited for their efforts. I hope whoever they are, they know that their work is appreciated, even if we can't officially acknowledge it. And I hope they understand that the thermos is waiting for them whenever they want to come back and claim it. I'm Lisa. I've been working as a backcountry ranger in the Sierra Nevada mountains for 10 years now, and I thought I'd developed good instincts about people and situations in the wilderness. Backcountry work requires you to make quick judgments about hikers' capabilities, weather conditions, and potential risks. Most days, those judgments are straightforward. Help someone with a twisted ankle, redirect hikers away from dangerous conditions, or check on overdue parties who've simply lost track of time. The Devil's Backbone Trail is one of the more challenging routes in our sector, a 12-mile loop that climbs through alpine terrain and requires solid navigation skills. It's not technically difficult, but the trail crosses several areas where weather can change quickly and route finding becomes critical. We see a fair number of search and rescue situations on Devil's Backbone, usually involving hikers who've underestimated the time and preparation required. On Tuesday evening, September 15th of 2023, I received a radio call from dispatch about an overdue hiker on the Devil's Backbone Trail. A man named Robert Chen had registered for a day hike that morning, with an expected return time of 6 p.m. When he hadn't returned by 8 p.m., his wife had contacted park headquarters to request a welfare check. This kind of call is routine for backcountry rangers. Most overdue hikers are simply running late due to unexpected delays, navigation errors, or overestimating their hiking speed. I've responded to hundreds of these calls over the years, and the vast majority end with finding tired but unharmed hikers who just needed a little help getting back to the trailhead. I hiked out to the Devil's Backbone Trail system as the sun was setting, following the most likely routes that an overdue hiker might have taken. The weather had been clear all day, and conditions were good for both hiking and potential rescue operations. I carried my standard backcountry gear: first aid supplies, emergency shelter, extra food and water, and communication equipment. I found Robert Chen about 3 miles from the trailhead, sitting on a boulder beside the main trail, looking tired but not distressed. He was a middle-aged Asian man, maybe early 50s, wearing appropriate hiking gear and carrying a day pack that seemed adequately equipped for the route he'd attempted. When I approached him, Robert seemed relieved to see me, but not particularly worried about his situation. He said he'd gotten confused about the trail route and had spent several hours backtracking before ending up where I found him. He was tired and ready to head back to the parking area, but he wasn't injured or in any immediate distress. Robert struck me as an experienced hiker who'd simply had one of those days where everything takes longer than expected. He was properly equipped, had adequate water and food, and seemed to understand the mistakes he'd made during his navigation. We had a normal conversation about the trail system and the areas where hikers commonly get confused. I offered to escort Robert back to the trailhead, which is standard procedure for overdue hikers, even when they're not in distress. The hike out took about 90 minutes, and we reached the parking area just as full darkness was setting in. Robert thanked me for the assistance, got into his car, and drove away without any unusual circumstances. I completed my evening report according to standard procedures, documenting the successful resolution of the overdue hiker call. Robert Chen, day hiker, found safe on Devil's Backbone Trail at approximately 8:45 p.m. Escorted to trailhead. No injuries or equipment issues. Case closed as routine assistance. The next morning, I was surprised to receive another radio call about Robert Chen. According to dispatch, his wife had contacted park headquarters again, saying that Robert had never come home the previous night, and that she was now extremely worried about his safety. She was requesting a full search and rescue operation. I immediately called dispatch to clarify the situation, explaining that I had personally escorted Robert Chen to the trailhead the previous evening and watched him drive away. There must have been some kind of miscommunication or mistake in the reporting, but when dispatch checked their records, there was no registration for Robert Chen on September 15th. No day hiking permit, no overnight camping reservation, no record of anyone by that name checking in with park rangers or registering for trail access. I insisted that I had definitely assisted Robert Chen and that my evening report from the previous night would confirm the details of our interaction. When dispatch pulled up my report, they found documentation of the overdue hiker call and my response, but the name field was blank. According to the official record, I had responded to a call about an unidentified overdue hiker and had successfully assisted an unknown individual back to the trailhead. That made no sense. I distinctly remembered Robert telling me his name, and I was certain I had included that information in my report. I never file incomplete paperwork, especially for something as routine as an overdue hiker assistance. The search and rescue coordinator, Captain Martinez, asked me to come in for a detailed briefing about the previous night's incident. He wanted to understand exactly what had happened and clarify the discrepancies between my recollection of events and the official documentation. During the briefing, I provided a complete account of finding Robert Chen, escorting him to the trailhead, and watching him drive away in what I remembered as a dark blue sedan. Captain Martinez listened carefully and took detailed notes, but he also pointed out several problems with my account. First, the gate logs showed no vehicles entering or leaving the park during the time period when I claimed to have escorted Robert to the parking area. All vehicles accessing the Devil's Backbone trailhead have to pass through a monitored gate that records entry and exit times automatically. Second, the overdue hiker report had been filed by someone calling from a phone number that traced to a disconnected line. When park staff tried to call back for additional information, they found that the number was no longer in service. Third, there was no Robert Chen matching the description I provided in any of our missing person databases, and local law enforcement had no reports of anyone by that name missing in our area. Captain Martinez suggested that I might be confused about some of the details from the previous evening, possibly due to fatigue or the challenging lighting conditions during my response. He recommended that I take a few days off and consider whether stress or overwork might be affecting my judgment and memory. But I knew exactly what I had experienced. I had spent over an hour with Robert Chen, had normal conversations with him, and had watched him drive away safely. The man was real, the interaction was real, and my memory of the events was clear and detailed. I decided to investigate the situation on my own time, starting by reviewing all the documentation and records from September 15th. What I found only deepened my confusion about what had actually happened. My evening report was definitely in the system, filed at the correct time, and containing all the standard information except for the hiker's name. The report indicated that I had successfully resolved an overdue hiker situation, but it provided no identifying information about the person I had assisted. The dispatch logs showed the initial overdue hiker call coming in at 8:15 p.m., and they showed my radio confirmations during the response. But the original call was logged as coming from an unknown reporting party with no callback number or identification information. Most puzzling of all, when I requested copies of the gate logs from that evening, they showed my vehicle entering the park area at 7:30 p.m. and exiting at 10:45 p.m., which matched my recollection of the timeline. But the logs showed no other vehicles in the area during that entire period. According to the automatic gate system, Robert Chen's car had never been in the parking area where I had watched him drive away. I returned to the Devil's Backbone Trail several times over the following weeks, retracing the route where I had found Robert and looking for any evidence that might explain the discrepancies in the official records. The trail showed normal signs of regular hiking traffic, but I found nothing that would specifically indicate Robert's presence or support my account of the rescue. What bothered me most was not the administrative confusion, but the clarity of my memory about the interaction with Robert. I could recall specific details of our conversation, observations about his equipment and hiking experience, and the exact location where I had found him resting beside the trail. I had no reason to doubt my own perceptions or memory, but I also had no explanation for why none of those perceptions were supported by any official documentation or physical evidence. After a month of investigating on my own, I decided to let the matter rest. I filed a supplemental report noting the discrepancies between my recollection and the official records, and I recommended that the Park Service review its documentation procedures to identify potential gaps in data collection and reporting. But I also kept copies of all the relevant documents in my personal files, including my original evening report with the blank name field and the dispatch logs showing calls from unknown sources. I wanted to have the paperwork available in case anyone ever came forward with additional information about Robert Chen or the events of September 15th. The incident affected how I approach backcountry rescue operations. I now take more detailed notes during every interaction with hikers, including photos when appropriate, and verification of identifying information. I double-check all my reports before submitting them, and I maintain my own backup documentation for any unusual situations. But I also find myself paying more attention to the people I encounter in the backcountry, wondering about their stories and their destinations. Most hikers are exactly who they appear to be, heading back to families and jobs and normal lives outside the wilderness. But sometimes I wonder if some of the people we encounter in the mountains are traveling to places that don't appear on any map, following routes that don't lead back to the world the rest of us inhabit. People who need assistance getting back to wherever they're going, even if we can never quite understand where that is. I still work the Devil's Backbone Trail regularly, and I still respond to overdue hiker calls in that area. Most of them end the way they should, with tired but grateful hikers getting safely back to their families. But I always check my reports more carefully now, making sure that all the names and details are properly recorded. Because I learned that helping someone get home safely isn't always the same as helping them get back to a place where anyone will remember they were missing. I'm Tony. I've been working fire management for the Forest Service for 13 years now, specializing in prescribed burns and wildfire prevention across the Pacific Northwest. It's technical work that requires understanding weather patterns, fuel loads, and ecological systems well enough to use fire as a tool for forest health rather than a destructive force. Prescribed burns are carefully planned operations designed to reduce accumulated undergrowth and prevent catastrophic wildfires. We burn specific areas under controlled conditions, monitoring wind, humidity, and temperature to ensure the fire behaves predictably and stays within predetermined boundaries. When done properly, prescribed burns clear dangerous fuel loads while promoting healthy forest regeneration. The West Slope burn at Cascade Ridge had been in planning for over 2 years. The area covered roughly 300 acres of mixed forest that hadn't burned naturally in over 60 years, creating dangerous accumulations of dead vegetation and undergrowth. Our fire behavior analysts determined that a controlled burn during optimal weather conditions would reduce wildfire risk while improving habitat for native species. We initiated the burn on a Thursday morning in October of 2023, after 3 days of ideal weather conditions. Light winds, adequate humidity, and stable atmospheric conditions all indicated that we could execute the burn safely and effectively. Our crew of 12 specialists managed the fire using standard techniques, establishing fire breaks and monitoring the burn's progress as it moved through the designated area. The burn proceeded exactly according to plan. The fire moved slowly through the understory, consuming accumulated debris and dead vegetation while leaving most of the larger trees intact. By Friday evening, we had successfully burned the entire prescribed area and were monitoring for hotspots and potential flare-ups. Standard procedure requires a thorough post-burn assessment to document the fire's effects and identify any areas that need additional treatment or monitoring. I began the assessment early Saturday morning, walking systematic transects through the burn area to evaluate fuel consumption, tree mortality, and overall burn effectiveness. Most of the burn area showed typical results. The fire had consumed accumulated organic matter on the forest floor, cleared dense undergrowth, and created the kind of open forest structure that reduces future fire risk. Larger trees showed minor bark charring, but were expected to survive and continue growing normally. But as I worked my way through the northern section of the burn area, I started noticing something unusual about the burn pattern. Scattered throughout the burned forest were perfect circles of unburned grass, each about 6 feet in diameter. The circles were too regular to be natural fire breaks, and they didn't correspond to any obvious features like rock outcroppings or wet areas that might have protected vegetation from the fire. At first, I thought these might be spots where our drip torches had malfunctioned or where crew members had inadvertently created small fire breaks. But the circles were perfectly round and showed no signs of suppression activity. The grass inside each circle was completely untouched by fire, while the areas immediately surrounding them showed normal burn patterns. I documented the first few circles with GPS coordinates and photographs, thinking they might represent some kind of unusual fuel moisture condition or microclimate effect. But as I continued my survey, I found more circles following what appeared to be a deliberate pattern across the landscape. The circles weren't randomly distributed. They formed rough lines and geometric arrangements that suggested intentional placement rather than natural occurrence. I counted 23 circles total, arranged in patterns that reminded me of survey markers or archaeological site layouts. What really caught my attention was what I found in the center of each circle. Each unburned area contained a single object placed precisely in the middle of the grass. Not natural items like rocks or fallen branches, but human artifacts that had no logical reason to be in the middle of a forest burn area. The first object I examined was a car key attached to a simple metal ring. The key showed signs of long exposure to weather, but was still identifiable as belonging to a 1980s Ford sedan. It was sitting upright in the grass, as if someone had carefully placed it there moments before the fire passed through. The second circle contained a wedding ring, a simple gold band that appeared to be a woman's size. Like the car key, the ring showed weathering consistent with long-term outdoor exposure, but it was positioned deliberately in the exact center of the unburned grass. I continued documenting each circle and its contents. A child's toy truck, painted red and blue but faded from years of sun exposure. A wristwatch with a broken band. A small silver locket that opened to reveal a faded photograph of a young woman. Each item was placed with the same careful precision in the center of its protective circle. By the time I finished surveying all 23 circles, I had documented a collection of personal items that told stories of individual lives. Car keys, jewelry, toys, personal accessories, the kind of things people carry with them daily and would notice immediately if lost. I reported my findings to my supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, who manages prescribed burn operations for our district. Janet had never seen anything like the unburned circles, and she couldn't explain how the fire had skipped over such precise areas while burning normally everywhere else. More puzzling was the presence of the personal items. Janet pointed out that our pre-burn surveys had covered the entire area thoroughly, including metal detector sweeps to locate any hazardous materials. Our crews would have found and removed any obvious human artifacts before initiating the burn. Janet decided to contact law enforcement to report the discovery of potential evidence from unknown incidents. The collection of personal items suggested that the forest might have been the site of unreported crimes or accidents, and proper investigation required coordination with agencies that had criminal investigation capabilities. Sheriff's Deputy Williams arrived the following Monday to examine the burn site and document what we'd found. Deputy Williams photographed each circle and collected the personal items as potential evidence, treating the site as if it might be related to criminal activity. The deputy also noted something that I had missed during my initial survey. Several of the circles contained what appeared to be disturbed soil beneath the unburned grass, as if something had been buried in those locations at some point in the past. Deputy Williams arranged for a forensics team to examine the site more thoroughly, using ground-penetrating radar and other specialized equipment to determine if the circles marked burial sites or other subsurface features. The forensics investigation lasted 3 days and confirmed that most of the circles showed evidence of soil disturbance consistent with burial activity. But the radar couldn't determine what might have been buried or when the burial activity had occurred. More significantly, the forensics team identified several of the personal items we'd found. The car key belonged to a 1984 Ford Escort that had been registered to a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had been reported missing in 2008 while hiking in our forest district. The wedding ring matched the description of jewelry belonging to Jennifer Walsh, a camper who had disappeared with her husband during a weekend trip in 2012. The child's toy truck was identified by the family of 8-year-old Marcus Chen, who had vanished with his parents during a hiking trip in 2015. Deputy Williams showed me the missing person files associated with the items we'd found. 15 different cases spanning nearly 20 years, all involving people who had disappeared in or near our forest district. Families, individual hikers, and campers who had simply vanished without leaving any trace of their fate or location. The cases had all gone cold after extensive searches failed to locate the missing people or any evidence of what had happened to them. But now, their personal belongings were being found arranged in precise patterns throughout a forest that had just been burned under controlled conditions. The discovery triggered a major investigation involving multiple agencies and specialized forensics teams. The 23 circles were excavated carefully, revealing buried items and disturbed soil at each location. But no human remains were found, and no evidence was discovered that would explain what had happened to the missing people. The investigation concluded that the circles marked sites where personal belongings had been buried, possibly by someone who had encountered the missing people in the forest. But without additional evidence, investigators couldn't determine whether the burials were related to criminal activity or some other unknown circumstance. The missing person cases were reopened and assigned to a joint task force. But after 6 months of investigation, no new leads were developed. The task force concluded that while the discovery of the personal items was significant, it didn't provide enough information to determine the fate of the missing people or identify any suspects. I completed my fire management responsibilities for the West Slope burn, documenting the unusual findings in my final report and recommending continued monitoring of the area for any additional discoveries. The burn had achieved its ecological objectives despite the unexpected complications from the investigation. But I've never been able to forget those perfect circles of unburned grass, or the careful way each personal item had been placed in the exact center of its protective area. The fire had consumed everything else in its path, but something had preserved those precise spots where families and individuals had left their final traces. I've supervised dozens of prescribed burns since then, and I always pay extra attention to unusual burn patterns or unexpected discoveries. Fire reveals things that have been hidden in the forest, sometimes for decades. Usually it's just old logging equipment or forgotten campsites, but occasionally we find things that raise questions about the stories these mountains keep. The West Slope burn area has regenerated well over the past year. New grass and wildflowers are growing where the fire cleared the understory, and the forest is developing the kind of healthy structure that will resist future wildfire. It's exactly the kind of ecological improvement that makes prescribed burning such an important forest management tool. But I still have GPS coordinates for all 23 circles where we found those personal belongings. Sometimes I wonder if there are other forests, other burn areas, where similar discoveries are waiting for the right conditions to reveal what's been buried beneath years of accumulated vegetation. And I wonder about the 15 families who lost people in these mountains, whether they've found any peace in knowing that someone took care to preserve and protect the small things their loved ones left behind, even if we may never understand who provided that care or why they arranged it in patterns that only fire could reveal. I'm Rachel. I've been managing visitor services at Redwood Falls State Park for 9 years now, overseeing everything from educational programs to facility maintenance for our main visitor center. It's a job that requires attention to detail and good organizational skills, managing staff schedules, coordinating with other departments, and ensuring that our educational facilities serve the thousands of families who visit the park each year. Our visitor center is a modern facility that opened in 2015, featuring interactive exhibits about local wildlife, geology displays, and educational programs for school groups and families. The building operates on standard business hours, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. during peak season, with reduced hours during winter months. Outside of operating hours, the facility is secured with electronic locks, motion sensors, and a comprehensive security camera system. The security system was installed when the building was constructed, with cameras covering all public areas, entrance points, and exterior approaches. The system records continuously and stores footage for 30 days before automatic deletion. We rarely need to review the recordings except for occasional vandalism incidents or equipment malfunctions. On Monday morning, November 6th of 2023, I arrived at work to find that our weekend security guard had reported a possible break-in at the visitor center. According to his report, he'd found an exterior door slightly ajar during his Sunday morning rounds, though he'd found no evidence of actual intrusion or damage to the facility. The security guard, a retired police officer named Bob Martinez, who'd been working for us for 3 years, said he'd checked the building thoroughly and found everything in normal condition. No missing items, no vandalism, no signs that anyone had actually entered the facility. But the fact that a door had been found unsecured was concerning enough to warrant a thorough investigation. I spent Monday morning reviewing our security protocols and checking the physical condition of all doors and windows. Everything appeared normal. Locks were functioning properly, windows were secure, and our alarm system showed no record of any breaches or malfunctions over the weekend. But because we take security seriously, especially in a facility that contains expensive educational equipment and serves children's programs, I decided to review the weekend security footage to verify that no unauthorized entry had occurred. I started by checking the footage from Sunday morning, around the time Bob had found the unsecured door. The exterior cameras showed Bob arriving for his rounds at 6 a.m., walking around the building and discovering the partially open door on the east side of the facility. His reaction looked genuine, surprise at finding the door ajar, followed by careful inspection of the area. I reviewed the footage backward from that point, looking for any signs of someone leaving the building or tampering with the door. The exterior cameras showed normal nighttime conditions. Empty parking areas. Occasional wildlife moving through the landscape, but no human activity around the building. I expanded my review to cover the entire weekend, fast-forwarding through hours of empty corridors and quiet exhibit areas. Most security footage is mind-numbingly boring. Just static shots of empty rooms under emergency lighting, with timestamps marking the slow passage of hours. But when I reached the footage from early Sunday morning, around 3 a.m., I found something that made me stop and rewind the recording. The interior cameras showed a family walking through our main exhibit hall. A man and woman with 2 young children, maybe ages 6 and 8, moving casually through the displays like normal visitors during regular operating hours. They were looking at exhibits, reading informational plaques, and behaving exactly like the hundreds of families who visit our center every week. The family appeared completely normal. The parents were dressed in casual outdoor clothing, appropriate for hiking or camping. The children were well behaved, staying close to their parents and showing typical curiosity about the wildlife displays and interactive exhibits. Nothing rushed, nothing furtive, nothing that suggested they were aware of being in the building illegally. I watched them move from exhibit to exhibit for nearly 30 minutes of recorded time. The father pointed out information on the geology displays to his children. The mother read aloud from the plaques describing local wildlife habitats. The kids pressed buttons on interactive exhibits and watched the responses with normal childhood enthusiasm. They looked like any family enjoying an educational visit to our facility, except they were there at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the building was supposed to be locked and secure. I immediately checked the door access logs for the weekend. Our electronic lock system records every time a door is opened, whether by key card, manual key, or from inside the building using emergency releases. The logs showed no entries or exits between closing time Friday evening and Bob's arrival Sunday morning. I also checked the motion sensor logs, which record every activation throughout the building. The sensors are calibrated to detect human-sized movement and are positioned to cover all public areas and corridors. But the logs showed no motion sensor activations during the entire weekend, including the time period when the security cameras clearly showed a family moving through the building. That was impossible. The motion sensors and cameras operate on independent systems, and there's no way people could move through the building without triggering the sensors. I tested the system that afternoon and confirmed that it was functioning normally. I couldn't walk 10 feet in any direction without activating multiple sensors. I called our security system contractor to report the apparent malfunction and request an immediate inspection of all equipment. The technician, a specialist named Dave Chen, who'd installed our original system, arrived Tuesday morning to conduct comprehensive testing. Dave spent 4 hours checking cameras, motion sensors, door locks, and the central control system. He ran diagnostic tests on every component and reviewed the system logs in detail. According to his analysis, all equipment was functioning normally and showed no signs of malfunction or tamper. But Dave also couldn't explain how the camera footage showed people in the building when the motion sensors detected nothing. He said it was technically impossible for someone to move through our facility without triggering the sensors, especially a family with children who would naturally spread out and cover more area. Dave suggested that maybe the timestamp on the camera footage was incorrect, that the family might have been recorded during normal operating hours and somehow mislabeled as nighttime footage. But when I checked our visitor logs and compared them to the clothing and appearance of the family on the recording, I found no match for anyone who'd visited during the time frame when the footage could realistically have been recorded. I also noticed something else troubling about the footage. While the family moved normally through the exhibits, the lighting in the building appeared to be normal daytime illumination rather than the dim emergency lighting that should have been in effect during overnight hours. The exhibits were fully lit, interactive displays were operational, and visibility was excellent throughout the facility. But our overnight lighting system provides only basic illumination for security purposes. The main exhibit lighting, interactive displays, and educational systems are all automatically shut down after closing time to conserve energy and extend equipment life. There's no way for visitors to activate full lighting without access to manual override controls that require staff-level authorization. I reviewed more footage from that weekend, looking for any explanation of how the family had gained access or why the security systems had failed to detect their presence. What I found only deepened the mystery. The cameras showed the family arriving in the main exhibit hall at 2:57 a.m., but they didn't show them entering the building. The family simply appeared in the hall, between one camera frame and the next, as if they'd materialized from empty air. Similarly, they disappeared from the footage at 3:28 a.m., without any record of them leaving through doors or windows. I expanded my review to cover several weeks of previous footage, wondering if this was a recurring issue that we'd somehow missed. Most nights showed normal empty building conditions, but I did find 3 other instances over the past month where the cameras had recorded people in the building during overnight hours. Each incident followed the same pattern: families or individuals appearing in the exhibit areas without any record of entry, moving normally through the displays, then disappearing without any record of exit. In each case, the motion sensors showed no activity, the door logs showed no access, and the emergency lighting appeared to be replaced by normal daytime illumination. I documented everything I'd found and reported it to park management as a serious security concern. My supervisor, District Manager Karen Mills, initially treated it as an equipment malfunction that needed immediate attention. But when she reviewed the footage herself and confirmed the testing results from our security contractor, she became more concerned about the implications. Karen contacted our regional security office to request an investigation by specialists with more advanced equipment and experience with unusual security incidents. A team of federal investigators arrived the following week to conduct a comprehensive analysis of our facility and security systems. The investigators spent 3 days testing equipment, interviewing staff, and reviewing all available footage. They confirmed that our security systems were functioning normally and found no evidence of tampering or unauthorized access. They also couldn't explain how people appeared on camera footage without triggering motion sensors or access controls. The lead investigator, a specialist named Dr. Patricia Wong, told us that while the situation was unprecedented in her experience, it didn't appear to represent a security threat to park operations or visitor safety. The people on the footage were behaving normally and showed no interest in damaging equipment or accessing restricted areas. Dr. Wong's final report classified the incidents as unexplained equipment anomalies and recommended continued monitoring of the security system. She noted that while unusual, the recordings didn't show any criminal activity or pose any apparent threat to facility security. The incidents continue to this day. About once or twice a month, I review security footage and find recordings of people in the building during overnight hours when no entry should be possible. Always, families or individuals behaving like normal visitors, always appearing and disappearing without triggering any other security systems. I've stopped reporting each incident as a security concern and instead maintain my own log of the unusual footage. The people on the recordings seemed genuinely interested in our educational exhibits and appear to be getting value from their visits, even though their presence is technically impossible. Sometimes I wonder if our visitor center serves a broader community than we realize, attracting visitors who don't follow normal schedules or entry procedures, people who appreciate the educational value of our exhibits and find ways to access them outside of conventional operating hours. The building continues to function normally during regular business hours, serving hundreds of families each week with educational programs and interactive exhibits. Our daytime visitors never report anything unusual, and our security systems work perfectly for detecting normal intrusions or equipment problems. But I've learned to expect the occasional overnight visitor who appears on camera without appearing anywhere else in our security system. People who seem to understand that knowledge and education don't follow business hours, and who find ways to access learning opportunities regardless of locks, sensors, or administrative schedules. I hope they're getting something valuable from their visits, even if I can't understand how they're managing to be there. And I hope they appreciate the effort we put into creating exhibits that are educational and engaging, even when viewed by audiences we never intended to serve. Sometimes the most important work we do is for people we never get to meet officially, people who find ways to benefit from our services, despite barriers that should make their access impossible. I'm Mark. I worked as a seasonal park aide for the Forest Service during the summer of 2023, my second year in a temporary position that helped me gain experience while I finished my forestry degree. Seasonal work involves whatever needs doing: trail maintenance, visitor assistance, facility upkeep, and the various end-of-season tasks that prepare remote sites for winter closure. The job taught me to work independently and follow detailed procedures, skills that are essential for permanent positions with the Forest Service. Most seasonal aides hope to transition into full-time careers, so we take the work seriously and try to demonstrate reliability and attention to detail in everything we do. Pine Ridge Research Station sits about 8 miles back in the forest, accessible only by a rough service road that requires four-wheel drive during the best conditions. The station serves as a base for wildlife monitoring, ecological research, and weather data collection during the summer months, when researchers can access the remote location regularly. The facility itself is modest: a small cabin with basic living quarters, a laboratory space for processing samples, and storage areas for research equipment. Solar panels provide electricity for essential systems, and a generator backup ensures continuous power for scientific instruments that collect data year-round. During the research season, which runs from May through September, the station is staffed by various scientists, graduate students, and technicians who spend weeks at a time conducting field studies. Outside the research season, the station is typically unmanned, but continues collecting automated weather and environmental data that gets transmitted electronically to university research centers. My supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, explained that the end-of-season shutdown involves securing equipment, winterizing the water system, and performing maintenance tasks that ensure the facility will be ready for researchers when they return the following spring. It's routine work that seasonal employees handle every year, following detailed checklists and documentation procedures. Dr. Walsh assigned me to complete the Pine Ridge shutdown during my final week of employment, which fell in the last week of September. She provided me with keys to the facility, maintenance checklists, and contact information for technical support if I encountered any problems with equipment or systems. The research season had officially ended 3 weeks earlier, and all researchers had returned to their home institutions by early September. Dr. Walsh confirmed that no one should be at the station when I arrived, and that I would be working alone to complete the winterization tasks. I drove out to Pine Ridge on a Monday morning, following the increasingly rough service road as it climbed through dense forest toward the research site. The drive takes about 45 minutes under good conditions, and cell phone coverage disappears completely once you're more than a few miles from the main highway. The research station looked exactly as I expected: quiet, clean, and properly secured. The solar panel system was functioning normally. The generator was in standby mode, and all external equipment appeared to be in good condition. I unlocked the main cabin and began working through the shutdown checklist, starting with an inventory of research equipment and supplies. Everything inside the cabin was well organized and properly stored. Research instruments were secured in their designated locations, laboratory supplies were inventoried and locked away, and personal living areas showed no signs of recent occupation. The researchers had clearly followed proper procedures when they vacated the facility 3 weeks earlier. I spent the first day completing equipment inspections and beginning the process of winterizing water lines and heating systems. The work was straightforward but time-consuming, and I planned to finish the shutdown over 3 or 4 days before returning to pack up my own belongings and conclude my seasonal employment. That evening, while organizing paperwork and research logs that needed to be returned to headquarters, I noticed something unusual about the station logbook. Every research facility maintains a daily logbook where staff members record weather observations, equipment status, and significant events or observations. The logbook serves as an official record of station activities and provides continuity information for researchers working at different times. The Pine Ridge logbook was a standard government issue bound notebook with dated entry pages for the entire year. I expected to find entries covering the research season through early September, followed by blank pages for the period after researchers had departed. But when I opened the logbook to the current date, I found recent entries that continued through the previous day. Someone had been making daily observations and equipment checks, documenting weather conditions and wildlife sightings with a kind of detail that indicated regular professional monitoring. The handwriting was neat and consistent, showing careful attention to standard formatting and documentation procedures. The entries included temperature readings, precipitation measurements, wind observations, and notes about animal activity around the station. Everything was recorded with the precision and regularity that characterizes good scientific field. But I didn't recognize the handwriting, and the entries covered dates when the station was supposed to be unmanned. I checked the signature lines at the bottom of each daily entry. The logs were signed with initials that I couldn't identify. JM, written in the same neat handwriting as the rest of the entries. No one named JM had been listed among the researchers working at Pine Ridge during the past season. I reviewed several weeks of entries, looking for any indication of who might have been maintaining the logbook. The observations showed intimate knowledge of local conditions and wildlife patterns, the kind of familiarity that comes from extended field experience in the area. More puzzling was the accuracy of the recorded data. I checked the weather measurements against the electronic monitoring systems that automatically record temperature, humidity, and precipitation. The handwritten observations matched the electronic data perfectly, suggesting that whoever was making the entries had access to the same instruments I was using. I spent Tuesday morning trying to figure out who might have been visiting the station without authorization. I called Dr. Walsh on the satellite phone to ask if she'd given access to any other researchers or if there were any ongoing studies that I hadn't been informed about. Dr. Walsh said she definitely hadn't authorized anyone to use the station after the official research season ended. She was puzzled by my description of the continued logbook entries and asked me to photograph several pages and send them to her electronically for review. When Dr. Walsh examined the photos, she confirmed that she didn't recognize the handwriting or the initials JM. She also noted that the observation techniques and data recording methods showed professional-level competence, suggesting that whoever was making the entries had significant field research experience. Dr. Walsh said she would investigate whether any researchers from other institutions might have been granted access to the station, but she asked me to continue with the shutdown procedures and document anything else unusual that I found. I completed the mechanical and electrical systems winterization on Tuesday and Wednesday, working through the detailed checklists and verifying that all equipment was properly secured for the winter months. Everything at the station appeared normal, except for the mysterious logbook entries. On Wednesday evening, I decided to spend the night at the station to see if anyone appeared to make the next day's logbook entry. If someone was visiting the facility regularly, they might not realize that an official shutdown was in progress and that I was working at the site. I set up sleeping gear in the main cabin and positioned myself where I could observe the logbook and laboratory area without being obvious about surveillance. I stayed awake until well after midnight, but I saw and heard nothing unusual around the station. Thursday morning, I checked the logbook first thing and found a new entry dated for Wednesday. The entry followed the same format as previous days, documenting weather conditions, equipment status, and wildlife observations with the same neat handwriting and professional attention to detail. The entry had been made while I was sleeping in the same building, but I hadn't heard anyone enter the cabin or move around the facility. The entry was dated and signed with the same JM initials as all the previous days. I completed the final shutdown tasks on Thursday and prepared to lock up the facility for the winter. Before leaving, I made copies of the most recent logbook pages and took additional photographs to document the continued entries. I also left a note in the logbook asking JM to contact Dr. Walsh if they saw my message. When I returned to headquarters on Friday to conclude my seasonal employment, Dr. Walsh had completed her investigation of possible unauthorized station access. She'd contacted all the research institutions that had worked at Pine Ridge during the past several years, and none of them had any ongoing studies or any researchers with the initials JM who might have been using the facility. Dr. Walsh also checked with the Forest Service Law Enforcement Office to see if they had any reports of unauthorized access to remote facilities in our area. The officers said they occasionally dealt with trespassers or squatters at vacant Forest Service buildings, but they hadn't received any reports about Pine Ridge Research Station. I left my seasonal position with the mystery unresolved. Dr. Walsh said she would have law enforcement check the station periodically during the winter months to see if anyone was accessing the facility, and she would investigate further when the research season resumed the following spring. I found a permanent forestry position with a different agency and didn't return to work at Pine Ridge the following summer. But I stayed in touch with Dr. Walsh, and she provided updates about the research station when I asked about the logbook situation. According to Dr. Walsh, the daily entries continued throughout the winter months, despite the station being officially closed and inaccessible due to snow closure of the service road. When researchers returned in May, they found a complete set of daily observations covering the entire winter period, all in the same neat handwriting with the same JM signature. The winter entries included detailed snow depth measurements, temperature records, and wildlife observations that would have required daily visits to the station under challenging conditions. The data was scientifically valuable and showed intimate knowledge of local ecological conditions during a period when no official research was being conducted. Dr. Walsh said the research team decided to incorporate the mysterious observations into their official data sets, since the information was accurate and professionally collected. They also left a formal note in the logbook thanking JM for maintaining such comprehensive records and inviting them to contact the research team if they were interested in participating in official studies. No one ever responded to the invitation, but the daily entries continued throughout the following research season, complementing the work being done by official researchers. The entries showed awareness of ongoing studies and often included observations that were relevant to current research projects. Dr. Walsh said the research team eventually came to view JM as an unofficial colleague who contributed valuable data and maintained the station with the kind of care that reflected genuine commitment to the scientific mission. They stopped trying to identify JM and instead focused on incorporating the observations into their research work. I've often wondered about who JM might be and why they chose to maintain such detailed records at an unmanned research station. The commitment required to visit the facility daily, regardless of weather conditions or seasonal access challenges, suggests someone with deep dedication to scientific observation and environmental monitoring. Maybe JM is a retired researcher who found purpose in continuing the kind of work they'd done throughout their career, maintaining scientific records even when no institution required or recognized their efforts. Or maybe it's someone who understands the value of long-term environmental data and chose to contribute to that knowledge base, regardless of official authorization or recognition. I hope JM knows that their work is appreciated by the research community, even if their identity remains unknown. The daily observations represent the kind of dedication to scientific understanding that advances our knowledge of natural systems, and that contribution has value regardless of whether it happens within official channels. Sometimes the most important work gets done by people who choose to do it simply because it needs to be done, people who understand that scientific observation and environmental stewardship don't depend on job titles or institutional affiliations. I'm Jennifer. I've been working as a logistics coordinator for the Forest Service for 7 years now, managing supply deliveries and resource allocation for 14 fire towers across the Cascade Mountain region. It's detail-oriented work that requires keeping track of everything from emergency supplies to communication equipment, making sure our fire detection crews have what they need when they need it. Fire towers are critical infrastructure for early wildfire detection, staffed by trained observers who monitor vast areas of forest for signs of smoke or fire activity. Most towers operate seasonally, with observers living on site during high fire danger periods and maintaining regular radio contact with dispatch centers. Fire Tower 12 sits on Granite Peak, about 25 miles northeast of our main district office. It's one of our more remote installations, accessible only by a narrow Forest Service road that requires four-wheel drive and takes nearly 2 hours to navigate. The tower serves as an observation post for some of our most fire-prone terrain, including areas that have experienced major wildfires in recent decades. The tower itself is a traditional steel structure, about 80 feet tall, with an enclosed observation cabin at the top and a small living quarters building at the base. During fire season, observers typically spend weeks at a time at the tower, using high-powered binoculars and radio equipment to scan their assigned territory for any signs of fire activity. Tower 12 had been staffed by an observer named Robert Chen for the past 3 seasons. Robert was an experienced firefighter who'd transitioned to tower duty after a knee injury made ground crew work difficult. He was reliable, professional, and well-suited to the solitary nature of fire tower operations. The 2023 fire season had been challenging, with extended drought conditions and higher than normal fire danger ratings throughout our region. Our tower observers had been working longer shifts and maintaining heightened vigilance as conditions remained critical well into the fall months. In early October, Robert had requested a week of leave to attend his daughter's wedding in California. This was the first leave he'd taken all season, and I arranged for temporary coverage while he was away. But when Robert was scheduled to return on October 15th, he called to say that a family emergency would extend his absence indefinitely. Robert said his elderly mother had suffered a serious fall and needed extended care that would prevent him from returning to tower duty for the remainder of the season. He apologized for the short notice and said he would submit his resignation paperwork as soon as he could handle the administrative details. Finding replacement staff for remote tower positions on short notice is always challenging, especially late in the fire season when most qualified observers are already assigned to other duties. I was working on staffing solutions when I received radio check-ins from Tower 12 that suggested someone was already covering Robert's position. The check-ins came through our standard communication schedule, with proper call signs and protocols. The voice wasn't Robert's, but tower observers sometimes use relief staff or temporary personnel during staffing transitions. I assumed that someone from our regional crew had been assigned to cover Tower 12 until I could arrange permanent replacement. But when I checked with our staffing coordinator, no relief personnel had been assigned to Tower 12. According to official records, the tower was unmanned following Robert's departure, and no one should have been making radio check-ins from that location. I decided to drive out to Tower 12 to clarify the staffing situation and ensure that whoever was operating the facility had proper authorization. I also planned to deliver the weekly supply run that had been scheduled before Robert's departure. The drive to Granite Peak took nearly 3 hours in late October conditions, with early snow making the Forest Service road treacherous in several sections. When I arrived at Tower 12 around noon, I found the previous week's supply delivery still sitting on the porch of the living quarters building, exactly where I'd left it 7 days earlier. The supply boxes were unopened and showed signs of weather exposure, suggesting they'd been sitting outside for the entire week. This was unusual because tower observers typically bring supplies inside immediately, both to protect the materials and to inventory what they've received. I unloaded the current week's supplies, and stacked them next to the previous delivery, then climbed the tower stairs to check on whoever was manning the observation post. The climb to the top of an 80-foot fire tower is strenuous under the best circumstances, and the steel stairs were slippery with frost from the previous night's cold snap. When I reached the observation cabin at the top of the tower, I found it clean, well organized, and apparently in active use. All the radio equipment was functioning normally. Logbooks showed recent entries documenting weather conditions and fire danger observations, and the facility appeared to be maintained by someone with professional knowledge of tower operations. But I found no one in the observation cabin, and there was no indication of where the observer might have gone. All the equipment was powered on and ready for use. The radio was set to the correct frequency for our communication network, and observation instruments were positioned as if someone had been using them recently. What struck me as most unusual was the arrangement of personal belongings in the cabin. A coffee mug sat on the desk next to the radio, still warm to the touch. A jacket hung on the back of the observer's chair, and personal items like reading glasses, a wristwatch, and a thermos were arranged on shelves as if someone lived in the cabin permanently. The logbook showed entries for every day since Robert's departure, recorded in handwriting I didn't recognize, but following proper documentation procedures. Weather observations, visibility reports, and fire danger assessments were all recorded with the kind of detail and consistency that indicated professional-level competence. I called out hello several times, thinking the observer might be in the lower building or working somewhere around the tower base, but I received no response, and I could see the entire area around the tower from the observation deck. No vehicles other than mine were visible, and there was no sign of anyone working in the vicinity. I spent about 30 minutes reviewing the logbook entries and checking equipment to make sure everything was functioning properly. The radio check-in schedule showed that the next contact with dispatch was due in 2 hours, so I decided to wait and see if the mystery observer would return before that time. But as I prepared to climb back down the tower, I noticed something that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite explain. The personal items in the observation cabin weren't just arranged casually. They were positioned with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested someone had taken great care to create a specific arrangement. The coffee mug was centered exactly on a small square of paper that looked like it had been positioned as a coaster. The reading glasses were aligned parallel to the edge of the desk. The jacket was hung on the chair with careful attention to how the sleeves fell. Everything looked like a museum display or a staged photograph, rather than the natural disorder of someone's workplace. I climbed down the tower and checked the living quarters building at the base. The door was unlocked, and the interior was clean and well-maintained, but it showed no signs of recent occupation. No food in the refrigerator, no personal belongings in the bedroom areas, no indication that anyone had been living there recently. Most puzzling was that the supply boxes I'd delivered the previous week were still sitting unopened on the porch. If someone was actively manning the tower and making regular radio check-ins, they would need the food, batteries, and other supplies that those boxes contained. I loaded the unopened supplies back into my truck and returned to the district office to report what I'd found. My supervisor, District Fire Management Officer Karen Rodriguez, was as puzzled as I was by the situation. She confirmed that no personnel had been assigned to Tower 12, and she had no explanation for the radio check-ins or the maintained condition of the facility. Karen decided to investigate the situation more thoroughly, starting with a review of our communication logs to verify the radio transmissions I'd reported. The logs confirmed that Tower 12 had been checking in according to schedule, using proper call signs and providing routine status reports. But when Karen tried to match the radio transmissions to recorded voice samples from our personnel files, she couldn't identify who was making the calls. The voice didn't match any of our current or recent employees, and the communication style suggested someone with professional fire service experience. Karen contacted Robert Chen in California to ask if he had any knowledge of who might be covering his position at Tower 12. Robert said he definitely hadn't arranged for anyone to staff the tower, and he was surprised to learn that someone was making radio check-ins from his former assignment. Over the next week, I made 2 more supply runs to Tower 12, hoping to encounter whoever was maintaining the facility. Each time, I found the same situation: previous supplies untouched, radio equipment functioning normally, logbook entries current and professional, but no sign of the person responsible for the ongoing operations. On my 3rd visit, I decided to remain at the tower for several hours to see if anyone would appear. I positioned myself where I could observe both the tower and the access road, thinking that whoever was manning the facility would eventually return from wherever they went during the day. But after 4 hours of waiting, including through the scheduled radio check-in time, I never saw anyone approach the tower or leave the area. The radio check-in was made precisely on schedule, broadcast from the observation cabin 80 feet above where I was sitting, but I neither saw nor heard anyone climb the tower to make the transmission. I reported this final observation to Karen, who decided to classify Tower 12 as unstaffed for the remainder of the fire season. She said the radio transmissions were probably being generated by some kind of automatic system or equipment malfunction, even though that didn't explain the handwritten logbook entries or the maintained condition of the facility. Fire season ended in November, and Tower 12 was officially closed for the winter months. When observers returned to staff the towers the following spring, I made sure to personally deliver the first supply run to Tower 12 to see if the winter closure had resolved whatever unusual situation we'd encountered. I found the tower in perfect condition, clean and well-maintained, despite months of winter weather and no official caretaking. The observation cabin was organized exactly as I'd found it the previous fall, with the same careful arrangement of personal items and the same immaculate attention to operational details. The logbook showed entries for the entire winter period, documenting weather conditions and maintaining the kind of detailed records that indicated daily visits throughout months when the access road was impassable due to snow. All entries were in the same unidentified handwriting, signed with initials I couldn't match to any current or former personnel. Karen assigned a new permanent observer to Tower 12 for the current season, a veteran firefighter named Maria Santos, who had extensive experience with remote tower operations. When I delivered Maria's first supplies and helped her get settled, she mentioned that the facility was the cleanest and best-maintained tower she'd ever been assigned to. Maria said it was obvious that someone had been taking excellent care of the tower, maintaining equipment and keeping detailed operational records. She seemed pleased to be working at a facility that had been maintained to such high standards, and she planned to continue the same level of professional documentation that had been established by her predecessor. I've continued making regular supply runs to Tower 12 throughout the current fire season, and the tower operations have been completely normal. Maria makes her scheduled radio check-ins, maintains proper logbooks, and uses supplies at the expected rate for a fully staffed remote facility. But I still wonder about the period when Tower 12 was officially unmanned, but continued operating with the kind of professional competence that indicated experienced fire service personnel. Someone was clearly dedicated to maintaining that facility and continuing its fire detection mission, even when no official assignment or recognition existed for their work. I hope whoever provided that service understood how important their contribution was to forest fire protection. Fire towers save lives and property by providing early detection of wildfires, and that mission continues regardless of staffing challenges or administrative complications. Sometimes the most critical work gets done by people who choose to do it because they understand its importance. People who maintain essential services even when no official position or recognition exists for their efforts. I'm Carlos. I've been working night security for the National Park Service for 6 years now, covering the graveyard shift at Cascade Ridge National Park headquarters. It's quiet work that suits me fine, making rounds, checking facilities, and ensuring that park buildings and equipment stay secure during overnight hours when most staff are home with their families. The job involves regular patrols of all park buildings, from the main visitor center to the maintenance shops, to the staff housing complex that sits behind the administrative headquarters. Most nights are routine, checking doors, testing alarm systems, and documenting any unusual conditions or equipment problems that need attention during normal business hours. Night security requires attention to detail and the ability to work alone for extended periods. You develop routines and patterns that help you stay alert and ensure complete coverage of all facilities during each shift. After 6 years, I know every building, every system, and every normal sound or condition that characterizes a properly secured facility. The staff housing complex consists of 12 small apartments that the Park Service maintains for employees who need temporary or seasonal accommodations. The units are modest but well maintained, providing basic living space for rangers, researchers, and other staff who work in remote locations or need housing assistance during their employment. Occupancy in the staff housing varies depending on seasonal staffing levels and budget allocations. During busy seasons, most units are occupied by seasonal employees or temporary personnel. During quieter periods, several units typically remain vacant but are maintained in ready condition for future assignments. Budget cuts implemented in early 2022 had reduced our seasonal staffing significantly, leaving most of the staff housing units vacant for extended periods. By summer of 2023, only 3 of the 12 units were occupied, with the remaining 9 sitting empty but maintained for potential future use. Unit 4B had been vacant since the previous year, when budget reductions eliminated several seasonal positions and reduced our temporary housing needs. The apartment had been properly cleaned and secured, with utilities maintained at minimal levels to prevent damage, but no active occupancy or regular use. During my nightly rounds, I always check the exterior of the staff housing complex, looking for signs of unauthorized access, equipment problems, or maintenance issues that need attention. The vacant units require particular attention because empty buildings can develop problems that go unnoticed without regular occupancy. For most of the past year, the staff housing rounds had been routine and uneventful. The occupied units showed normal signs of residential activity, while the vacant units remained properly secured and showed no signs of disturbance or deterioration. But starting in late September of 2023, I began noticing unusual activity around Unit 4B. The first time I noticed something different was during my 11 p.m. rounds on a Tuesday evening. As I walked past the staff housing complex, I saw lights on in Unit 4B. Not just the basic security lighting that's maintained in all units, but warm interior lighting that suggested someone was home for the evening. I could also hear what sounded like normal domestic activity coming from the unit. Television sounds, footsteps moving around inside, the muffled sounds of someone going about their regular evening routine. Nothing unusual or disturbing, just the kind of everyday activity you'd expect from any occupied apartment. My first assumption was that the Park Service had assigned someone to Unit 4B without updating the security patrol checklist. Personnel changes happen regularly, and sometimes security isn't immediately notified when housing assignments are made or modified. I made a note to check with administration the following day to confirm the new occupancy and update my patrol documentation accordingly. I also continued my rounds without disturbing whoever had moved into the unit, since they appeared to be settling in normally and didn't require any security assistance. But when I mentioned the apparent new occupancy to my supervisor the next morning, she told me that no one had been assigned to Unit 4B and that all staff housing assignments went through her office with mandatory security notification. She asked me to check more carefully during my next patrol and report any signs of unauthorized occupancy that might require investigation or removal. Unauthorized use of government housing is a serious violation that can result in criminal charges, so we needed to determine quickly whether someone was occupying the unit without permission. During my next rounds, I again observed lights and activity in Unit 4B, but this time, instead of just making notes and continuing my patrol, I decided to approach the unit and make contact with whoever was inside. I knocked on the door and identified myself as park security, following standard procedures for contacting residents during security rounds. I expected someone to answer the door and explain their presence in the unit, either with proper authorization or with an explanation that I could verify with administration, but no one answered my knock, even though I could clearly hear activity inside the apartment. The television was still playing, and I could hear footsteps moving around as if someone was going about their normal evening activities. When I knocked again and called out more loudly, the sounds continued without any response or acknowledgement. I used my master key to enter the unit and check for anyone who might need assistance or who might be occupying the space without authorization. Security personnel are authorized to enter park housing units during emergencies or when investigating potential violations of occupancy policies. But when I opened the door and turned on the lights, I found Unit 4B completely empty and showing clear signs of long-term vacancy. The apartment was clean but dusty, with furniture covered in protective sheets and personal belongings removed. The television was unplugged and positioned against the wall. The kitchen showed no signs of recent use, and the bedroom areas contained only basic furniture with no personal items or evidence of occupancy. Most puzzling was that I could no longer hear any of the activity that had been clearly audible from outside the unit. No television sounds, no footsteps, no indication that anyone had been in the apartment recently. The unit was completely quiet and obviously vacant. I checked every room thoroughly, looking for any sign that someone had been living in the unit or had left recently. But everything was exactly as it should be for a properly secured vacant apartment: clean, organized, and showing no evidence of unauthorized use. I completed a detailed inspection report and recommended that administration review the security procedures for vacant housing units. I also requested clarification about whether any authorized personnel might have access to Unit 4B for maintenance or inspection purposes that could explain the lights and activity I'd observed. But when administration reviewed my report and conducted their own inspection of Unit 4B, they confirmed that no one should have been in the unit and that no maintenance or inspection activities had been scheduled. The unit was supposed to be completely vacant and accessible only to authorized security and administrative personnel. Over the next several weeks, I continued to observe the same pattern during my nightly round: lights and normal domestic activity coming from Unit 4B, followed by complete emptiness and obvious vacancy when I investigated directly. The activity seemed to follow a regular schedule, typically occurring during my 11 p.m. rounds and continuing until I approached the unit directly. As soon as I knocked on the door or attempted to make contact, everything would become quiet and the apartment would be obviously empty when I entered to investigate. I started documenting these incidents more carefully, noting the specific times, types of activity I observed, and the conditions I found when I investigated. The pattern was consistent: apparent normal occupancy, followed by immediate vacancy as soon as I attempted direct contact. I also started paying attention to other details that might explain what I was experiencing. Unit 4B was positioned where I could observe it from multiple angles during my rounds, and the apparent activity was always convincing from a distance, but never supported by evidence when I investigated closely. The sounds I heard always seemed appropriate for normal evening domestic activity: television programs, footsteps, occasionally what sounded like running water or kitchen activity. Nothing dramatic or unusual, just the routine sounds of someone living their normal life in a small apartment. But when I entered the unit during these incidents, I never found evidence that anyone had been there recently. No warm appliances, no disrupted dust patterns, no signs that furniture had been moved or that anyone had been using the facilities. After 2 months of documenting these incidents, I decided to discuss the situation with other security personnel to see if they'd experienced similar issues with vacant housing units. I spoke with both day shift guards and the weekend security supervisor about unusual activity in empty buildings. None of the other guards reported anything similar, but the weekend supervisor mentioned that he'd occasionally heard reports from maintenance staff about lights being on in vacant units when they arrived for work in the morning. The lights were always off, by the time security checked the buildings, so the reports had been attributed to timer malfunctions or electrical issues. I also learned that Unit 4B had been occupied until the previous year by a seasonal employee named David Martinez, who had worked at the park for 3 consecutive seasons before budget cuts eliminated his position. Several staff members remembered David as a quiet, dedicated employee who had seemed to genuinely enjoy living in the park housing. When I asked about David's departure, staff members said he'd been disappointed about losing his position, but had handled the transition professionally. He'd cleaned his unit thoroughly and left everything in excellent condition when his seasonal employment ended. No one had maintained contact with David after his departure, and administration said they had no forwarding address or current contact information for him. His employment had ended when his seasonal position was eliminated, and he'd moved on to other opportunities without maintaining ongoing connections to the park. I continued documenting the incidents through the winter months, maintaining detailed logs of each occurrence and the conditions I found when investigating. The pattern remained consistent: apparent normal domestic activity that disappeared as soon as I attempted direct contact or investigation. My supervisor reviewed my documentation and suggested that I might be experiencing some kind of equipment malfunction or environmental condition that was creating false impressions of activity in the vacant unit. She recommended that I have the building's electrical and HVAC systems inspected to identify any mechanical issues that might explain the unusual observations. The maintenance inspection found all systems functioning normally, with no malfunctions or conditions that would explain lights or sounds occurring in the vacant unit. The electrical system was properly shut down to minimal levels, and no timers or automatic systems were active that could create the appearance of occupancy. I've continued working night security at Cascade Ridge, and the incidents at Unit 4B have become a regular part of my patrol routine. I still observe apparent activity during my 11 p.m. rounds, and I still find the unit empty and obviously vacant when I investigate directly. I no longer report each incident individually, but I maintain my own documentation of the ongoing pattern. The activity never seems threatening or problematic, just the routine sounds of someone living a normal life in a small apartment behind park headquarters. Sometimes I wonder if some people become so attached to places where they've lived and worked that they continue going through the motions of daily life even after circumstances force them to move on. Maybe David Martinez found something valuable in his years of living at Cascade Ridge, something worth maintaining, even when official employment and housing authorization no longer existed. I hope whoever is creating the activity in Unit 4B is finding some kind of peace or satisfaction in maintaining their evening routines. The sounds are always comfortable and domestic, suggesting someone who's content with simple pleasures and familiar surroundings. And I've learned that some aspects of security work involve accepting patterns that don't have clear explanations, as long as those patterns don't represent actual threats to people or property. Sometimes, the best security response is simply documenting what you observe and letting people maintain their connections to places that have been important to them, even when those connections exist only in the space between what security cameras record and what happens when no one is looking directly.